Story number 1. That title didn't come from a publisher. It came from a day when curiosity outpaced common sense, and 4 kids walked into a mouth of wood and shadow. Back then, I've received more than a few questions about how I got into writing horror. And the truest answer is this: I met something that preferred me with my eyes wide open. I always loved scary stories, but as I reached my teenage years, I felt cheated. No glowing eyes in the window, no footprints circling my bed. That changed when we moved. We'd always lived on the East Coast, near the Appalachian Mountains, where the hills wore a blue horizon and the forest felt civilized. The Midwest was completely the opposite, and that difference cut me like a paper edge I didn't see coming. Our new neighborhood had a name for that paper edge. We called that abrupt back end to our neighborhood the Edge. On one side, lawns and mailboxes. On the other, a thicket that didn't want you back. I was 14, the special age where you're just cool enough to know how cool you weren't. Angry in a way that didn't have a target. My only friends were the other outcasts. There was Hans, careful and practical. Chris, all mouth and bravado. And Caitlin, our token weird girl, kinder than the rumors. We drew a dare around a rumor. There was a house back there, too, a mile or 2 back, and it was well known in the neighborhood as haunted, because its primary claim to fame was a strange sound that could only be heard while inside. We went in daylight. We weren't stupid enough to try it at night. The path through the edge wasn't a path at all. The forest was more moderate in height, and much more tangled. The kind of undergrowth that grabs your socks and remembers your skin. The middle of Ohio was rife with sudden sheer canyons, and every parent carried a ghost story about a kid who took one wrong step and never told another joke. The house showed up sideways, as if somebody had placed it at an odd angle, then changed their mind and walked away for 50 years. 4 holly trees flanked the front, green daggers around a porch that looked disturbingly like a mouth. And the front door sat ajar. We stalled, because stalling is what bravery does before it decides who's in charge. Then the sky cracked open, and surprise rain drove us onto the porch like cattle. "Yeah, that makes this way less scary," Chris commented. Water rattled down the roof. The light thinned. The windows held a dim haze of dust like smoke that had forgotten what to burn. Hans put a hand on the door, and it swung in without resistance or sound. We stepped into 2 dark planes, above and below a dim haze. The whole house pattering, creaking, and breathing. "This sucks," I said, and nobody argued. We tested each step like a trap might clap somewhere we couldn't see. Once all 4 of us were inside, Hans let the door swing silently shut, and for a moment the rain became our heartbeat. A creak upstairs, another near the dust-covered sofa. Then the sound we'd come for rolled up from the floorboards, a rumbling like a theater next to yours when the subwoofers start a war. "Of course, the basement," I said, because a story like this only goes one way. The stairwell gaped, a gaping black door. "After you," Chris said. I went first. The wood held. The light didn't. The rumbling was louder here, and the floor carried a subtle vibration that reached up through my legs, like something testing the meat. What the dimness showed felt curated by a bad angel. 3 pitchforks over there, a goddamn bear trap on the wall, rusty shovels, hung machetes. Every ancient farm equipment piece had found an angle that pointed at us. "This looks dangerous," Caitlin said. It was. But danger you can name never scared me as much as the kind you can't. We moved at a snail's pace, splitting the room like 2 scouting parties. Eventually, we all made it to the end of the basement, where the sound became quite loud. "Wait," Hans said, and he pulled a bar to probe the floor. The earth fell away suddenly, opening a 3 or 4 foot gap into a dark spill of stone and rainwater, working their way down what looked like a 100-foot spillway. "It's a cut-through to the gorge," I said, assembling a mental map from school bus windows and neighborhood gossip. "That's the sound. We're hearing the river." The spillway looked uneven, lined with boulders and steep drops, a throat that would chew and keep whatever fell. That's when fear arrived without a reason. Not the healthy kind, not the "oh no, we might slip" kind. This was a sudden rush of fear. The aura of fear the older kids bragged about like they'd kissed it at a party. It kept rising, sharper and sharper, nearing panic, with my heart pounding faster until logic had to shout to be heard. I checked the dark, like a lifeguard scanning a lake. "You guys see anything?" Nobody did. The body message said something was approaching. I decided to risk a stupid experiment, because I was a perverse fear-seeker, even when my knees said otherwise. I closed my eyes against the private theater of my eyelids. A figure assembled from static, a silhouette of monochrome spectral lines, flickering gray against black, its outline in constant motion, clad in ethereal torn clothes and covered in gaping wounds, neck bones jutting under a head tilted wrong. It moved in slow, shambling steps forward. I opened my eyes. Gone. I closed them. It was halfway across the basement and moving toward us. Jesus Christ. "Close your eyes," I whispered. They refused. Then they obeyed. Then they almost broke, because seeing it made the fear breed. "We have to go," I said, every thought filed under survival. "It's going to push us in the hole." That line gave us a plan. "Go that way," I told Chris and Hans. I took Caitlin the other way, threading a jagged series of tools, hanging blades, and the hungry geometry of curled spines. Every few steps, I sampled the darkness, eyes open to live, eyes closed to see. "Caitlin, where's it going?" She didn't want to look into that private cinema. "Look, please look," she said. And then she did, her voice tightening. "It's close to Chris," and a cry from Hans cut the sentence. We kept moving, because stopping would write our names on the floor. At the stairs, survival became a physics problem. I grabbed Chris by his shirt and kept him from falling onto an upright pitchfork. We spilled upward into air that didn't taste like iron. I risked one last look back with my eyes closed, and the thing leered at me, a sideways grin that said, "You think you've gotten away." We hadn't. Not yet. At the top of the stairs, daylight felt like an old friend who'd moved away without leaving a number. Hans pressed his cut forearm to his shirt. Caitlin's breathing hitched in little bursts. Chris tried on a grin, and it fell off his face. The rain hadn't stopped, just softened, so the house listened to us, wooden lungs expanding and settling. We'll just be careful, I said, mostly to keep our thin line from snapping. The sound's closer here, but the sound wasn't the problem anymore. Something was moving toward us, and it wanted the kind of mistake you make with your eyes wide and your brain on fire. We edged for the door. The porch looked disturbingly like a mouth, and I couldn't decide if that meant we were leaving the throat or stepping between teeth. 4 holly trees flanked the front, needles wet and glossy. And beyond them, the edge waited, completely unkempt forest that swallowed trails and spit out rumors. Do we run? Chris asked. If we run, I said, we'll bolt blind and give this place the one wrong step it wants. I didn't say the rest. If we look, we'll look into it. The front door sat ajar behind us, a hinge-shaped question. I closed my eyes for a heartbeat. Against that total blackness, a silhouette of monochrome spectral lines glitched forward, the head tilted, the neck bones jutting like a broken railing. It wasn't fast. It didn't have to be. Fear did the running. We took the porch in a sideways shuffle. The boards answered, pattering, creaking, and breathing. I kept our math simple. Open eyes for nails, closed eyes for the thing. Caitlin's knuckles latched my sleeve. Boys first, she'd said earlier, half joking. Now there was no joke left to borrow. When our shoes hit the steps, the house tried one last conversation. A creak upstairs, a whisper of weight where none should be. Not yours, I told it. Not today. We slipped into the rain. I go. The edge made a different kind of darkness, a green one. Branches tangled, the underbrush clutched at our ankles, and the clay promised to become glass if we hurried. Somewhere out there, the gorge made its own weather. It sounds like the ocean, Caitlin said, and now I heard it in the leaves, a tidal hush that never reached the sand. Keep your eyes open for roots, closed for the guest, I said. Hans, how bad? Just a cut, he muttered, concerned, but steadier. Now that the walls weren't leaning on him, we moved by memory, not by trail. The middle of Ohio was rife with sudden sheer canyons, and every step wrote a tiny will. At a knot of younger trees and thick undergrowth, I stopped and tested the world like a door. Eyes closed, the corpse image had left the house. It stepped between holly and rain. Slow, shambling steps forward. Eyes open. Twigs and slick roots. A thorn waiting for regret. Chris bumped my shoulder. Say it's not following us, I can't, I said. But I can tell you the rule it plays by. They waited. Afraid people look around. It makes people afraid on purpose, so their eyes stay wired open. So what? Keep them shut till we walk into a canyon? He snapped. Trade one risk for another, I said, and hated how adult I sounded. But the mental map was clear. If we slanted right, we'd hit the drainage that led back to the cul-de-sac. If we missed it, we'd find the spill that never forgave. We slanted right. I kept sampling the black screen theater. Each time, the flickering gray sharpened. My pulse ticked upward, then down as it stalled on bramble or invisible topography. The thing obeyed the room it was in, even when the room was the world. It didn't glide, it navigated. Somehow, that made it worse. Choice was involved, Caitlin whispered. Tell me when to look. I counted 3 heartbeats, Then, now, she winced and squeezed them shut. Where is it? Behind, but closing. It doesn't like the rain. It likes roofs. Then keep it roofless, Chris said. And there was the old sarcasm. Dented, but not dead. A suburban fence post appeared, moss cloaked, leaning like a drunk who'd lost his corner. Civilization had teeth too. Chain link, garden stones, a hose that wanted to be a snake. We slipped through a break in the wire and found a lawn that pretended nothing was beyond it. A trampoline sagged underwater. A pink plastic car drowned in grass. No one home. The whole block at work or asleep to the edge on purpose. Don't stop, I said. It still has a line of sight. We're not in the house, Chris argued. That aura didn't start there, I said. It started when we resolved to enter, and it smelled the plan. We cut across 2 yards and reached the cul-de-sac, like survivors who couldn't explain the ship. Our street was all pretty streets and mailboxes, landscaped lawns, weekend projects on weeknights. I tasted the impulse to turn and spit some triumph toward the trees, but I closed my eyes instead. The grayscale outline in constant motion had paused at the break in the fence. It cocked that wrong tilt as if to listen. Then it resumed. Slower. Testing. It didn't love the open. Inside, I said. My place. We took the tight formation of houses, like a company, withdrawing, with colors intact. My mother's car was gone. The front door unlocked. The living room smiled the bland smile of furniture that never expected history. I pulled the blinds, every last one. The room darkened to a room a stranger might choose. Are we smart? Hans asked. Not yet, I said. But we will be in the dim. I explained a plan that felt like a dare. It wants our eyes open, so we starve it. No staring into corners, no scanning doors, no trying to spot what the fear wants. When it spikes, close your eyes and get position. Call it out. Left, right, near, far. We move accordingly. We own the theater. You're asking me to not look for danger, Chris said. I'm asking you to look where it lives, I said, tapping my eyelid. On its terms, not ours, the house settled around us. The rain stepped down a register, across the dark. I felt something like an electrical pressure, the meaning you get when a room is occupied by a thought. Positions, I said. We triangulate like we're tracking a bat, and then it was there. A notch higher, like the projector had found focus. Eyes open. The couch, the rug, the water ring on the table from a cola I never finished. Eyes closed. The corpse image 5 paces from the door, covered in gaping wounds, clad in ethereal torn clothes. Slow, shambling steps forward. Door, I said. 5 paces. Left of door, Caitlin whispered. Closer. Center, Hans said, voice shaking less now. We moved. A step right, 2 back. A counter between us and the approach. The fear obeyed the geometry. The pressure dipped when we put wood, fabric, anything in the line. It was a strange kind of science, a lab with no instruments. But we were too smart for our own good, and suddenly had a use for it. Why is it here? Chris asked, quieter now. Because the edge is a border, I said. Things like borders, old farm to new suburb, Moderately civilized landscape to dark forest. That sudden divide. Maybe it can't cross unless someone opens a door. We opened one. We close it. Caitlin said. Yeah, I said, but not by ignoring it. By starving the way it hunts. We held for an hour we didn't measure. The pressure thinned like an argument losing heat. When I checked the black screen, the spectral lines had fuzzed out, then returned, then thinned again. The thing could wait. So could we. When my mother's car finally sighed into the driveway, the room changed. The normal came home and rearranged the molecules. I checked one last time. Eyes closed. The grin was gone. Eyes open. The window showed rain beads on glass. The fear didn't leave entirely. Some animals never do. But it retreated to the fence line. A hunter end of shift. Tomorrow, Chris said. We never talk about this. Tomorrow, I said. We talk about it to the one person who'll fix the hole. The association, Hans said. The one that tore down old sheds when they got unsafe. Caitlin added. Yeah, I said. We'll give them a ticket to some measure of popularity, if that's what it takes. And I meant it. But that night, the house hummed. And I learned how to sleep with my eyes closed, on purpose. News in a suburb spreads like a weed that knows which yards water too much. Our discovery led to a fundraiser by the neighborhood association. But that was the headline, not the story. The story was 4 kids trying to promote safety without sounding like camp counselors, and a house that had learned our names. We did posters. Chris stole the printer paper from his dad's office. Caitlin drew the edge as a jagged line with a little square house teetering on it. Hans mapped the gorge in dotted ink. 100-foot spillway, sketched as a mouth that chewed rain. I wrote the words. Cut through to the ravine under the old property. Basements aren't for falling. Help us fill the gap. I didn't add. And help us close a door we opened. Adults turned out with folding chairs and polite faces. Mr. Carter from the end lot told a story about kids who fell in and died back when the quarry still pretended to be a lake. Mrs. Nguyen pledged to match anything raised by the bake sale. The HOA president smiled a smile that had mastered the art of town hall gravitas. It's good to see the next generation taking initiative, he said, and I remembered I was every teenager ever and kept my mouth from saying something that would put us back in the misfits column. The house didn't like the crowd. I could tell by the way the air thickened when we passed flyers near the edge. The fear wasn't a roar. It was a suggestion. Like a commercial you think you can ignore until you're humming it while brushing your teeth. When it spiked, I would close my eyes and check the aisle. The silhouette held to the property line, peering through hedges like bad weather. It did not cross the street. The border had borders. When the money hit a number, the men with machines arrived. They didn't care about auras or spectral lines. They cared about permits and liability and the cut-through that would swallow a kid and a lawsuit whole. Fencing went up first. Bright orange netting, like a warning vest for the earth. Then a small excavator licked the old porch that looked disturbingly like a mouth and took a bite. The front door, ever ajar, came off like a loose tooth. The holly trees shivered and lost a few leaves, but kept their posts like sentinels that had lost the plot. We stood back, the 4 of us, heat on our faces from the sun, baking off rain. Feels wrong, Chris said. Feels right, Hans corrected. Feels like a chapter ending. Caitlin said, and the word chapter put a hinge in my chest. The basement appeared in cross-section, a diagram of our bad decisions. The men whistled at the bear trap, clicked tongues at the machetes, and told stories of old farm junk that would make a lawyer sneeze. Then the bucket scraped dirt at the far wall and found the gap. The earth fell away, polite as a curtain. And there it was, the spillway with its boulders and steep drops, little gushing rivulets of rainwater polishing ancient shale. The foreman swore softly. "We'll fill that," he said, promise and threat together that night, with half a house in a dumpster. The aura of fear tried one more approach. It woke me like a hand on the shoulder. I lay there, breathing strained, and let the habit take over. Eyes closed, the corpse image stood in the doorway of my room, flickering gray against black, its outline in constant motion. It didn't step forward. It just stared, if you can call it that. When the eyes don't agree with the rest of the head, you had a plan, I whispered to it. And it was elegant. In that private theater, words feel like thinking aloud to someone who lives in a different grammar. It made people afraid on purpose, afraid people look around. They keep their eyes wide, and they don't close them. If I'd obeyed that instinct in the basement, we'd be falling still. I tried something I hadn't tried. I kept my eyes shut and refused to see it. I breathed and thought of the forest in the old place. Massive, old-growth trees with plenty of space underneath and a nice carpet of leaves. A blue horizon. I let memory fill the screen. Not the monochrome spectral lines. The pressure faded like a song through a wall. When I finally opened my eyes, my door was only a door again. By the end of the week, the house was torn down, and the hole filled in with stone, clay, and the kind of gravel that means business. The edge didn't retreat, but it accepted the edit. Kids biked the loop again. Parents remembered other things to worry about. We got what we'd bargained for, a certain amount of notoriety. In a middle school economy, that means cafeteria seats and invitations to later explorations and even worse locations. We never went back to the exact place where the porch used to be. Not as a group. We would pass the orange fencing on the walk home and not talk about the thing we'd seen with our eyes closed. I told the group almost everything when it was safe. Almost. I never told my friends what I'd seen in that last glance back. How the sideways grin mocked me. How it looked like it was counting on the next kid to look around instead of shutting their eyes for one impossible second. Maybe I saved that to write down. Later, when I could tuck it behind craft and pacing. There's more to this world than randomness and unfounded fears in the dark. It's not all loose floorboards and underbrush and moderate trees that look sinister after surprise rain. Sometimes there are kernels of truth in these stories, like seeds that wait for wild ground. Sometimes the trick that saves you isn't a weapon. It's a rule about attention. Years later, I would hear Chris telling it like a comedy with knives. Hans turning it into a cautionary manual. Caitlin making it a fable about listening to what your body says. I don't correct any of them. The versions matter. I think it's important we honor the eons-old tradition of sharing scary stories, because the strategies within might one day help someone escape from a horrible fate. My version keeps the part about closing your eyes. My version keeps the border and the edge. My version remembers how it felt to have a hammering heart and logic, and how those two together can make a map if you want the epilogue. It's in the voice I use now, late at night. Don't give the dark everything it wants. When you feel afraid of the dark for no reason, check what your attention's doing. Maybe it's being counted on. Maybe the instinct to stare at the darkness in fear isn't always the one you feed. Maybe the way out lives in a theater you carry with you, where you can choose the frame. And if you ever find a house built where two worlds overlap, with a basement that hums and a porch that looks like a mouth, take a friend who understands borders. Take a rule you tested once when you were too young to know it had saved you. Take a breath, and just once, close your eyes. The week after the demolition, normal tried to reset itself like a picture frame someone kept nudging straight. It almost worked, until gym class, when the teacher made us run the perimeter and the wind came off the edge with that mineral chill, as if a deep place were exhaling through teeth. Caitlin paced me, earbuds out. You feel it? Yeah, I said. Like a voice you can't hear yet. Hans jogged up behind us, cutting in. I checked the site. Gravel's tamped. They strung new fencing. Then, quieter. But the ground hums. We said nothing about spectral lines or aura of fear. We said words the living say at school. But that afternoon, we drifted, like iron shavings to a magnet, to the cul-de-sac where the mailboxes baked and the air shimmered. Past the hedges, the completely unkempt forest lifted its green shoulder, and beyond that, the edge sharpened into privacy. The lot where the house was torn down looked wrong because it finally looked right. No porch that looked disturbingly like a mouth. No front door sat ajar, daring us to confess interest. Just earth, orange mesh, stakes. Tell me why we're here, Chris said, hands in pockets like he could bluff the trees. Because borders keep their own hours, I said. And because we still owe a thank you to a rule that saved us. He rolled his eyes. This sucks, he said affectionately, and I smiled despite the grit on my tongue. We stopped at the fence and didn't cross. A small law. Observed. I closed my eyes and let the theater load. At first, nothing. A clean screen, like the projectors were off. Then a faint silhouette of monochrome spectral lines, not on the lot, but behind it. Deeper, testing the new grammar of the land. The outline, in constant motion, hiccuped, as if the fact of sky made it doubt itself. It took slow, shambling steps forward, then back, like a swimmer feeling a current. It's there, I said, voice low. But the fence is a sentence it can read. Caitlin took my wrist. Then we leave the sentence intact. We did. We left it there, in its dark forest, and we walked the long way home. That night, I tried to write about anything else. Space opera, cafeteria romance, an essay about blue mountains that had nothing to do with the Midwest was completely the opposite. But the page leaned toward the edge like a plant to a window. I gave in and sketched a scene I hadn't earned yet. A caller on a radio show describing a basement where you must close your eyes to see. I kept the voice simple, late night, and kind. I didn't give the thing a name. A month passed. Homework and basketball and the sleep of children who pretend to forget. We still walked together, the four of us. A column that rearranged depending on the sidewalk. We made a pact without saying it. No worse locations. We'd had our fill. But the world has a way of sending field trips. It came as a storm that didn't care about schedules. The creek swelled. The gorge took water like a letterbox stuffed with flyers. The culvert 2 blocks down gurgled and then coughed. Brown. Sirens wrote their neon ledger in the rain. My mother told me to stay inside. I said yes, and then I was outside. Because I was every teenager ever, and because something under my ribs kept saying, the border is changing right now, so we met at the corner. Plastic ponchos, flapping, breathing strained from a run we'd already done once too often. The storm undid the edits the association had made. It pulled at the gravel like a magician with patience. Where the lot dipped, a new sink opened, not to the spillway we'd seen, but to a lateral vein cut by water that wanted an easier angle. Don't, Hans said, grabbing my sleeve when I stepped toward the mesh. We can see from here. We could. Water rutted the fill and whispered down, testing for a path to the old cut-through. If it found one, the 100-foot spillway would wake like a god who remembered his job. It knows we're watching, Caitlin said, meaning the land, the storm, the thing, all one system now. I shut my eyes. The black screen lit, but not with the corpse image. The rain's logic made a pattern I could measure. Pulses, eddies, angles. Behind that pattern, at the far tree line, the flickering gray leaned its tilted head and waited for us to make the mistake it preferred. We starve it, I said. Same as before. We don't stare into the hole. We call the city. We call Carter. We stand here and watch the street. Not the wound. That's denial, Chris snapped. That's triage, I said, and dialed. We became 4 pylons with cell phones, umbrellas, and instructions. We flagged the first car with a flashlight beam, then the second, then the neighbor who didn't believe in closures. We asked the little kids who appeared like mushrooms to go home and draw the storm instead. We called the number that goes to a room with maps. And when fear tried its old speech, look there, look deeper, give me your gaze. We looked up. We counted houses, not hazards. We let professionals approach the fence. An hour later, the municipal crew arrived. Neon vests, bright as a warning, dreamed by a crow. They drilled holes for a trench box and shored the edge. They packed clay like stubborn bread. They set a berm and taught the water to take a different sentence. The storm, as storms do, age out of its anger and became an anecdote. The aura of fear thinned like steam. You didn't look, Caitlin said, proud and hoarse. I looked where it couldn't live, I said, and thought maybe that was a definition of growing up. When we finally went home, we didn't debrief. We carried quiet with the weight of wet shoes. I slept and dreamed an old dream. Massive, old-growth trees with plenty of space underneath and a nice carpet of leaves. And a road where suburbs were built in tight formation, and a line between them that didn't cut, but stitched. In the morning, The sky was the color of paper towels after a spill. I ate cereal and wrote 6 sentences that felt like rails laid true. I began to understand why some people make a life out of arranging fear into stories that honor the eons-old tradition of sharing scary stories. You take what tries to own your eyes, and you make it pay rent. That weekend, Hans asked if we were done. Done with houses, done with later explorations, and even worse locations. We're done, I said, and meant it in one tense. Not all of them. We were not. Of course. Stories do not end when you decide you're tired. They end when the border accepts your answer, and the thing that hunted you goes looking for a different grammar. For now, though, the edge went quiet. And quiet has its own sound if you sit long enough on a curb with people who know the rule. When the panic spikes for no reason, remember that you can choose where to put your gaze. When school let out for summer, Chris got a job stocking at the grocery store that still smelled like oranges, even in the bread aisle. Hans took a lifeguard class and learned to shout, "Walk," at kids who had never met an imperative. Caitlin convinced the library to let us run a teen strange histories night. I said I'd host, voice steady, lights low. The poster showed not a house, not a basement, but headphones and a lazy moon. We weren't going back. We were building a place where the dark would have to speak politely. On the first night, 6 kids showed, and 2 parents who pretended to browse travel guides while sitting within rescue distance. I opened with something easy, a local bit about the old quarry, a gorge that parents had often regaled us with tales about. The 1 or 2 a year rumor turned into civic signs and new fences. Then I told a different story, true, but shaped, about a strange sound that could only be heard while inside. I left out the bear trap and the curled spines and all the angles a lawyer would underline. I kept the lesson. When fear comes without prompt, I said into the dark that wasn't quite dark, that's not your cue to look harder. That's an ad. Save your eyes. Use them when they buy you something. I didn't say, close your eyes out loud. Not yet. I let the idea take the room like a scent. Afterward, a girl with a green scrunchie told me about her little brother who cried only in their hallway at night, never in his room. There's a vent there, she said, embarrassed by her own hypothesis. It rattles when the AC kicks. Maybe he hears a rumbling and thinks it's footsteps. Maybe he does, I thought. Or maybe the border in that house runs along a seam of ductwork, old wood, and attention. I suggested a rule. Keep the hall light on low, not off. Tell him if the panic comes, he can look at you, not the dark. Give his eyes a job. She nodded, like someone picking up a tool they could lift. When the library closed, we stayed in the parking lot longer than it took to unlock bikes. Feels better than bragging, Chris admitted. It is bragging, I said, and grinned. Just useful bragging. On Saturday, Caitlin's family threw a cookout. The backyard backed the edge like half the block, but it had the safer look of a place that knew it was watched. String lights, 2 citronella cans, a fence that didn't apologize. Adults laughed the music of ketchup bottles. We ate and did not think about a mile or 2 back where some other era had left a house like a dare. Then the air tilted. You learn these tilts. The smoke from the grill no longer went where it had. The dogs along the street went quiet with agreement. The conversation at table 2 lost its verbs. It wasn't dramatic. It was a sketch of drama. I closed my eyes and scanned the black. The silhouette, flickering gray against black, reappeared at the tree line, its outline in constant motion, head permanently tilted like a portrait hung wrong. Not nearer, not crossing, watching a party the way a storm watches windows. I stepped to Caitlin and said, "We keep the border loud." "How?" she asked. "Make it a game." I clapped a rhythm. Chris picked up the counterbeat. Hans grabbed 2 plastic cups and made them drums. Kids gathered because kids are gravity. We taught them a round about flashlights and 2 eyes resting. A tune you'd forget by morning, but remember in your bones when it mattered. The adults smiled at the wholesome nonsense. The aura of fear thinned, because fear is bad at math when sound breaks it into parts. Later, when paper plates sagged and parents negotiated, we weren't stupid enough to try it at night bedtime terms. I checked the private theater again. The corpse image had drawn back. The spectral lines fuzzed at the edges. A bad reception nobody in this yard wanted to fix. "You didn't tell them," Hans said when we were gathering bottles. "About, the seeing." "I told them enough," I said. "And I want them to keep their eyes wide for fire pits and scooters. The other rule is for when the dark asks rude questions." Caitlin touched the fence, palm flat. "Do you think it gets hungry?" "Yes," I said. "But maybe not in the way we think. Maybe it feeds on direction, on where people aim the instrument in their faces." "Attention," she said, and we let the word hang like a lantern. That night, I drafted a monologue about borders, roads, rivers, zip codes, promises. I wrote, "Your instinct to look around may be exactly what something is counting on." I crossed out something and wrote someone and crossed it out again. The page didn't like names any more than the trees did. It liked verbs. Count, look, hold, close. In July, the association sent a note. Final inspection passed. The lot would be reseeded in fall. A contractor would remove the holly trees if neighbors preferred. I pictured them, those 4 flanking points, outlasting 3 owners and 2 cicada cycles, guardians that didn't succeed at guarding, but stayed anyway. I wrote a letter back. Keep them. A week later, I walked alone, a thing I rarely did, to see if quiet stayed where we left it. The fence cast lines on my legs. The gravel had settled into a sentence with a period. I stood and practiced the rule, like prayer. If fear rises without reason, I choose my frame. The edge breathed out and in. No audience, no strange sound, just trees adjusting their green. On the way home, I crossed the pretty streets and saw a boy at the storm drain with a stick, finding out how water edits ground. He didn't look up. He didn't need to. I looked up for him, at the angle where sky and roof meet, where stories like to lurk for a dramatic entrance. Empty. Not always. Not forever. But today, it was just a town where kids learned borders without bleeding, and 4 friends carried a rule like a spare key. Years turn you into the narrator you used to imagine on the radio at midnight. Measured, a little tired, honest enough to keep callers calling. I left for college, then came back for summers that smelled like cut lawns and hot blacktop. The edge remained. Like a page margin, nobody wrote in again. Chris grew into his sarcasm until it fit him like a suit he'd earned. Hans kept saving people from the deep end. Caitlin took a job at the museum, where she built rooms that taught attention to behave. We didn't talk about the house much, not because it hurt, but because it had become architecture in us. When fear spiked, for no reason, no scary sight, no scary sound, we didn't argue with it. We asked what it wanted us to look at, and we gave our gaze a better job to do. On a late visit home, I did what I do now. I talked into a mic while the night leaned near. The show wasn't big. It was the kind kept alive by truckers, insomniacs, and people who fold laundry at unreasonable hours. "Tell me your border," I said one night. "Tell me where two worlds sit shoulder to shoulder, and pretend they're not listening." A man from another state spoke of a tunnel under an old mill. A nurse whispered about a hallway outside pediatrics, where the air pressure argued. A teenager said there was a house a mile or two back from his neighborhood, and that it was well known as haunted because of a strange sound that could only be heard while inside. I told him what someone should have told me. We resolved to enter the house and figure out, once and for all, the mystery of that sound is a sentence that can feed a thing for weeks. You don't have to resolve that. You can resolve to come home, I said. And if your chest jumps and your eyes beg to scan, you can do a rude thing right back. Close your eyes and get the layout. Don't stare the dark down. Starve it of the instrument it wants. He laughed, scared and relieved in the same sound. That's weirdly practical, so it's the only kind of magic I trust, I said. And hey, we weren't stupid enough to try it at night. You don't need the dare to count. I didn't tell him about the sideways grin, or the last time I saw it. That came later, when the lot where the house had stood finally sprouted a new home with a porch that looked like a porch, not a threat. I walked by one holiday, hands deep in pockets, and the new owner waved from steps with winter lights. "You grew up here?" she asked. "People keep telling me stories. People keep telling me stories too," I said, and we both laughed in the key of the Midwest. She invited me in for cocoa, and I almost said no, because superstition is a pest that makes lists. Then I said yes, because borders aren't for hiding from. Inside, the living room held plants that weren't afraid of windows. A dog thumped its tail at my shins like I was a memory it approved. "It used to flood over there," she said, pointing toward the back wall like a tour guide. "Whoever did the remediation did it right." "They did," I said. We talked about gutters, downspouts, the ordinary obsessions that keep buildings alive. When I left, the porch light drew a circle on the walk, and beyond that, the edge kept its counsel. I shut my eyes at the curb, out of habit. The spectral lines didn't show, just the inside of my lids and the afterimage of a yellow bulb. On the last night before I left town again, the four of us met at the park, where teenagers pretend not to be doing anything. We sat on swings like ghosts of ourselves. "Do you ever miss it?" Chris asked. "The adrenaline," I said. "No, the science. Sometimes. The rule," Hans said. "Oh, the rule," Caitlin echoed. "It's funny. Most advice says, pay attention. We learned the inverse." "Not inverse," I said. "Specific. Pay attention to what you choose. Don't donate your stare to something counting on it. We fell quiet and watched a bat write a messy sentence between lamp posts. I thought about kernels of truth and how they get planted by accident. I thought about the strategy the thing had used. It made people afraid on purpose, and how many other minds prefer us that way. I thought about how many halls and culverts and country roads didn't need ghosts to be dangerous. Do we tell it like a legend? Chris asked. Or do we tell it like an instruction manual? Yes, I said. And that felt right enough to stand. We honor both, the tradition and the trick. We bumped fists like kids, and it didn't feel stupid. It felt like stamping a page. On my way home, I cut by the edge one last time. A fog had come in shallow, the kind that edits ankles and leaves the rest to context. I stopped at the margin where grass stops faking it. The trees made their old wires overhead. I did the impolite thing and asked the dark a question. Are we done? No answer. And that was an answer. But the breath came. The same ebb and flow as rain on old boards, as pattering leaves, as a rumbling that used to be a river and was now the hardware of a good drain. I shut my eyes because I wanted to, not because fear told me to. And the theater played memory instead. 4 holly trees flanked the front, a wooden mouth, 2 dark planes above and below, a dim haze. A kid too smart for his own good, friends who weren't and were cool enough to know what they didn't know. I opened my eyes and walked home, not to lock a door, but to keep telling a story where the border and the rule both get the last word. If you ever find yourself at a margin like ours, here's the part I keep for last. Spoken slow, the way the radio likes. Don't give the night everything it asks for. If you feel fear inflate for no reason, check if your instinct to look around is being purchased by something that didn't earn it. There's a key in your pocket you can turn without your hands. Use it. Remember that. And maybe you'll step off the porch into rain and come back with your own version, to hand to someone who needs it more than you did. Story number 2. I stopped sleeping the year the house incident faded to rumor, when the nights felt safer than my own bed, and the neighborhood turned into a map of quiet choices. I'd walk until the sky thinned, and the world sounded like breath. I told myself the culprits were video games, soda, and that old hatred for school. But the truth was simpler. The dark listened. The gorge waited beyond the boardwalks, a split earth with rails and neat steps the association bragged about. It wasn't wilderness. It was a sanctioned edge. Edges always invite a step too far. One night, I saw it. A blue glow deep down the cut. The kind of blue that doesn't belong to weather or glass. It hurt my eyes, and then it followed me into sleep I didn't have. By morning, I had a plan, a name for the place, and 2 friends who had once sworn they'd never go near anything that talked. Chris arrived first, hands jammed in his pockets, promise already on his lips. I'm not going inside anything. No houses, no caves, nothing. I told him that was fine. Caitlin showed up with that sideways smile that turned the last of middle school into fog. What did you see? She asked. He said it was blue, Chris answered, crossing his arms, a dim blue light in the distance. I told them, somewhere down the gorge. It hurt my eyes. She didn't hesitate. She slipped through the rail like a note through a locker and started down the slope where roots poked out like handholds. The dirt crumbled, but the root was obvious. Older kids had carved it with shoes and secrets. We made the scramble to the bottom. Shoes muddy, fingers stinging. The gorge rose 50 feet on both sides, a hushed cathedral that swallowed voices and traded them back as echo. Waterfall to the left, impossible to climb. Creek running swollen with recent rains. The way forward was downstream, where leaves clung to stone and the air held that metallic cold of a half-remembered winter. A thin pattering worked itself down from above and became rain outright. We tried the slope again, but the mud turned to mush under our boots. "We're stuck," Chris said, and for once I didn't argue. "We'll walk out," I said instead, pretending certainty. "This has to lead to the river." We moved along the wall, my palm on mossy rock, my breath counting the seconds I refused to name. Something about the chill made the space feel rented, not owned. Caitlin shivered and muttered that she'd been colder, but her teeth didn't agree. Up above, the back of a house riding the edge like a dare. A fence that wouldn't stop a sleepwalker. We shouted. Nothing. Then, faint. "Hello?" The word slid along the stone as if it had learned our names. Chris took a step, then remembered the rule we'd made without saying it. When the voice comes from the darkness, you don't go to it. We went anyway. The trees thickened. The gorge narrowed. The light abandoned the ground in front of us, as if someone had taken a brush and painted black in the air. I told them to hold on and not let go. Thunder rolled overhead, a slow animal. The creek to my left, rock to my right. Rain streamed through the leaves and found the back of my neck like a hand. "Hello?" the voice said again, closer now, wearing an echo like second skin. It sounded human enough to sign for a package. I felt Caitlin's fingers tighten on my shoulder. There, in the black, a little blue orb gathered, as if coalescing from nothing. It floated, tilted, and another orb spun into view. Purple, but wrong, as if light could subtract itself. Eyes, blue and purple eyes scanning the wall, soft light sliding across stone. We dropped behind a boulder, hearts conducting a twitchy orchestra I didn't want to hear. "Hey, come check this out," the voice called, bland and cheerful, like a kid discovering a coin on the sidewalk. The shape moved, 6 or 7 feet tall by the throw of its light, and we ghosted around the rock and ran, half falling, half scrambling deeper where the darkness collected. The plan, don't laugh, was to find the river, because rivers are exits, and exits mean home. We didn't make it far. "Hello? Howdy? Hey, come check this out. Spare a dime?" Voices, a dozen of them, stacking on each other like a crooked choir. Across the black, pairs of blue and anti-purple eyes snapped open in random places. Their combined glow gave us outlines. Too much shape, and not enough mercy. From beneath each pair, shadows gathered themselves into vaguely human figures, 3 to 5 feet tall, faintly opaque, like someone forgot to finish them. The gorge blinked with that thin carnival of colors, drifting closer. Behind us, the first voice returned, chipper and patient. Caitlin squeezed once, the question you never answer out loud. "Back or forward. I chose back. I was already turning, dragging Caitlin with me, when Chris ripped free and sprinted forward, high-stepping the creek like a stubborn prayer. The rain went from problem to event. We hit the slope and the waterfall. Climbing was a dare we accepted with numb hands and cuts we'd count later. Caitlin scraped away mud until roots and rock gave us grip. We hauled up, ribs on fire, lungs bargaining with the cold. At the rim, we ran the edge, careful to stay well away from the crumble where loose rock might give. We should have gone home, but Chris was somewhere in that black, and the black had learned his name. We crossed above the dark zone and saw it from the safe angle. Unnatural, as if the rain-filtered daylight simply refused to exist there. Caitlin shouted, "Chris!" over and over. The canyon widened. The river opened like a door. "Right here, guys!" Chris's voice called from halfway down the wall. Caitlin ran toward the sound, and I grabbed her hood, yanking her back from a sudden cleft full of sharp rocks. We leaned out. At first, nothing. Then the trick died. Two lights, blue and purple, stared up at us. A huge form shifted away, dragging something heavy that left a dark smear in the rain. "It's a deer," I said, and my mouth believed me because my eyes needed to. Far off, at the gorge mouth, Chris, the real one, waved his blue jacket at someone by the river. He'd made it. "Go," I told Caitlin. "Make sure he's all right." She hesitated, then ran. I went the other way, because some answers refuse the front door. I lay on my stomach in the mud and peered over the edge of the dark, the small ones, a dozen, threw pieces of the deer back and forth, squabbling with a messy joy that made my teeth cold. Beyond them, the largest sat apart, eyes on me. Without looking away, it tore a leg free and tossed it to the rest. A family table. If you squinted at the wrong universe, then the darkness began to move, gentle at first, a slow stir, like foam, waking up. It thinned between one blink and the next, and suddenly I was looking at regular trees, leaves, water. The only proof was a scatter of bones, white, picked clean, some cracked for marrow. I lay there, with rain on my face, the gorge breathing like a living thing, and understood nothing except this. We hadn't discovered a monster. We'd crossed a dining room. We didn't go to the hospital. That would have been the logical thing, the safe thing, the report and explain thing. Instead, we huddled under the porch of a stranger's house while the rain slackened and watched Chris hold his knees and stare at nothing. His blue jacket steamed in the cold. The stranger asked if we were lost, then decided we weren't a story she wanted, and went back inside. Silence is a door that closes itself. We walked the long way home along the boardwalks, the neat rails and respectable steps suddenly looking like props in a set built for a lie. Caitlin kept glancing back toward the gorge, as if the darkness might remember her name and try it out. "Right here, guys," she said under her breath, not mocking, testing the shape of the words. I told her to stop. I told myself to stop. The mind loves a mimic when it wants to be punished. Chris slept at my place because his parents were out of town. and also because none of us wanted him alone with his voice. We spread towels over the carpet and failed to make tea. He said he was fine, which meant he wasn't. And then he said he didn't see eyes, which meant he did. I lay awake on the floor with the window cracked for air and listened to the neighborhood perform its ordinary echo. A car, a stray dog, someone closing a gate, and beneath it, something like breath, where breath shouldn't be. If you search long enough, you can hear your own fear answer you. Morning made liars of us. No one spoke of blue or purple. We said creek, mud, roots, slope, slipped, fell. We didn't say hello. We didn't say howdy. We definitely didn't repeat, hey, come check this out, or spare a dime. The words were bait. Even in daylight, they tasted like hook. By afternoon, Caitlin had turned the three of us into a committee. We sat on the floor with a map she'd printed and traced the trail with a pencil, arguing about where the black had started and where the air looked painted wrong. She circled the waterfall and drew a little skull by the boulder where we'd hidden. If we go back, she said. I told her I would. Chris said no, without looking up, and sometimes what you don't do is the bravest thing you manage all week. We stayed away for a while. Days became homework and video games and soda that didn't taste like anything anymore. Nights turned to insomnia with better branding. The quiet that had once felt like a void I owned was suddenly rented space with a landlord who had learned my name. At first, I blamed the house incident, then the gorge, then school itself. It was easier to argue with a building than with a memory that didn't follow rules. Caitlin texted late. Not a confession, she never did confessions, but a weather report of the soul. Chilly, overcast, light pattering. Chris stopped answering for a while. When he came back, he used less sarcasm than before, and when a teacher asked him a question, he spoke like someone who had decided quiet was safer than opinion. Weeks later, the association sent an email about trail safety and staying on paths. It didn't mention the gorge, but it didn't have to. The photos showed smiling families beside rails, boardwalks glistening in sunlight. I stared too long at a corner where the trees looked thicker than they should. We crop our dangers. The dangers learn how to live in the margins. I tried to forget. You know how that goes. I'd be walking home at dusk, and the fence behind one house would look too close to the edge, and I'd imagine waking at night to the sound of the back door opening itself. I'd see a scrap of plastic caught in branches, and my brain would file it under orb. The worst moments were the ones where nothing actually happened. Those thin instants when something almost spoke, and you had to decide whether to answer. We did go back once, not because we were brave, but because Caitlin asked, and I had a deficit of reasons to say no. We chose a gray morning when the river ran low and the leaves had begun to turn. The slope still showed the handholds where we'd come down, the same roots, a nick in the dirt where someone had slipped, a smear of old mud, like handwriting you don't want to read again. The waterfall murmured instead of roaring. The air smelled like mossy stone and cold water. We brought a rope and sense enough not to use it. At the place where the light had once refused to exist, we found only ordinary shade, the kind that gathers under trees when the sky can't be bothered. Bones still scattered the rocks, white, picked clean, one broken longwise for marrow. "Dear," Caitlin said, as if saying the word could absolve the scene. I told her it probably was. Truth is often just the most acceptable lie you can agree on together. What we didn't see mattered more. No blue, no purple, no eyes, no voice. The gorge was a park again. The kind of place you pose for a picture to send to a grandparent who still prints photos. We left nothing behind and took nothing except the story we wouldn't tell. Walking home, Caitlin said, "Maybe it's like fog. It burns off." I nodded. I didn't mention that fog comes back. That night, the world tried a new trick. Across the street, someone had strung up Christmas lights, first of the season, because there's always someone who wants to jump the line and declare a holiday early. Among the warm whites and cheerful reds hung a scatter of LED blue that wasn't the old blue I'd grown up with. It was the other kind, the blue that felt borrowed from a place where light hurts. I stood on the sidewalk and watched it until my eyes watered and my heart did that small wrong thing in my chest. "They're just lights," I told myself. The lie worked for 2 breaths. After that, the nights had a new sport. When the neighborhood quieted and the cars made their last passes, when the air cooled and the yard sprinklers ticked and went still, I'd hear a word that wasn't a word travel the length of the block. Not hello, not howdy, not any phrase I could arrest for trespassing, just the sensation of a call that knew how to become whatever you feared. I kept the window closed. I counted breaths in patterns I refused to call time. I wish I could say, this is the part where I became a rational adult, who files reports and reads science and insists on explanations that arrive with footnotes. Instead, I became someone who avoids edges and looks too long at mirrors and sleeps with headphones, playing rain that never ends. Chris drifted toward a new set of friends whose idea of danger was failing math. Caitlin learned to laugh at parties without moving her mouth. We were fine, which is to say, we weren't. Years later, at a store in December, I found myself staring at a wall of LED strands. There it was again, that shade of blue that didn't belong to this world. The package called it icy. I called it a memory that had learned electricity. I stood there until a clerk asked if I needed help. I said no, and the word sounded like it came from behind me. You expect an ending, a moral, a lesson, a clean drawer where the story goes to sleep. I have none. I have a gorge that wears park clothes by day and a dining room by night. I have voices that borrow human and eyes that turn light into hunger. I have bones and marrow and a broken map that marks boulders we survived by accident. And I have the smallest truth I can live with. We didn't meet a monster. We met a family. If that comforts you, I envy you. If it doesn't, well, somewhere there is a slope you've been avoiding. And somewhere there is a rail that won't save you. And somewhere a call is practicing your name. The year I left for college, the gorge receded into the kind of memory you keep in a drawer with broken keys. I studied late, collected odd jobs, pretended the night was mine again. Then a message from Caitlin arrived with no greeting, just a photo. A strip of LED blue tangled in branches beside rails, the kind that look official until you lean on them. The stomach remembers before the mind agrees. I wrote back, "Don't." And she sent a second photo. Bones on river stones, white, picked clean. "Dear," she texted. "Probably," I replied, which is what cowards say when they love someone. When I came home for a long weekend, she didn't ask. She told. We were going back. Chris said he would meet us at the boardwalks, and then didn't, which said enough. We took the trail anyway. The rain had been off and on all week. The creek a murmur that sounded like gossip. Leaves slicked the steps. The slope down was the same dirt and roots, as if time were a loop with muddy handholds. Courage is mostly repeating the motion that almost killed you before. At the bottom, the world drew breath and held it. The waterfall threw mist that salted our faces. The mossy wall pressed cold through my jacket. Ordinary air, ordinary shade, until we reached the place that wasn't. The light didn't vanish this time. It thinned, like paper held to flame. I could see the shape of the black before it arrived. "Stay behind me," I said, which is what fools say when they want to impress ghosts. We stepped to the edge of the not quite and waited. Nothing is harder than waiting in a place that has taught you to run. I spoke first, very softly, like a librarian with a secret. I said our names, mine, Caitlin's, Chris's, and told the darkness we were only passing through. The echo came back wrong, twice, the way a copy machine adds a hairline you can't scrub out. Then, from the bend ahead, "Hello?" Not shouted, not bright, but as if the word itself had remembered us. "It knows," Caitlin whispered. I didn't say what, because she was right, and categories would not help. The blue orb arrived. Then the purple one, the anti-light that bruises the eye. Eyes? Yes, and yet not simply eyes. Beneath them, a hum of shadows gathering vaguely human, faintly opaque. Smaller ones first, playful and awful. Then a pause that felt like attention, learning to stand. I thought about the last time and our mistake. We ran, and it multiplied. "Hey, come check this out," the voice said, conversational as a neighbor. I told the voice we had no choice but to leave. I said park words: safety, trail, association, rules, like talismans. They hung in the air like wet laundry. "Right here. Guys," came next, as if Chris were around the bend and a little winded. Caitlin winced. "Don't," I said, and then the voice said my name, perfect as a stolen key. It added, in my cadence, "I'm not going inside anything." My stomach lurched. The boulder ahead took on a posture that looked like memory. We weren't special. We were mirrors. What do you do when the gorge speaks in your mouth? I tried the simplest thing I had left. I asked a question. "What are you?" The blue tilted. The purple slid over rock. "Family," the voice said. Not like before. Not the way we'd named them, but as if the word belonged to them by right. The smaller shapes eddied. Children in a church aisle, and one tossed something that clinked on stone. A piece of bone, not deer, small and round, like a knuckle you don't admit you know. I didn't tell Caitlin what I thought. I said bones without plural, and she nodded anyway. Then the largest arrived. The feeling of height, more than a form. Eyes like coins made of cold. It did not hurry. It stood with the kind of stillness that turns witness into confession. The voice borrowed Caitlin next. "What did you see?" it asked, with her smile tucked into the vowels. She stiffened, and I stepped half a pace in front of her, because love is mostly choreography. "Not today," I said. And I meant not ever. But bargains lie. I pulled from my pocket the only ritual I could invent. A small paper bag of salt I'd bought at a diner, because old stories live in stupid places. I tore it open and poured a line across the path where the black thinned. A thin, white boundary that looked foolish even to me. The blue and purple swept down. Curious, like light testing glass. The line did nothing. Of course it did nothing. Science and superstition took hands and laughed at me. "Try names," Caitlin said. Eyes on the eyes. She spoke the names we'd avoided. "Hello?" "Howdy." "Hey, come check this out. Spare a dime?" She said them like labels, not answers. And each one dimmed the orbs a little, as if a voice grows weaker when you refuse the part it wants you to play. Refusal is a muscle. We had not trained it, but fear does push-ups on your behalf. The largest turned slightly, a tilt of attention. It made a sound I cannot write, because no alphabet will take it. A shift more than a syllable, the negative of speech. Then something changed behind us. A house door somewhere up on the rim. A fence creaking. A human cough traveling with the wind. The smaller ones looked up like raccoons interrupted. The largest didn't. It aimed its gaze at me, and the voice, using mine, said, "We'll just have to walk out." Then, in Chris's tone, "We're stuck." Then, in Caitlin's, "We have no choice." "You don't," I said, and heard the arrogance after it left me. "We do." I took Caitlin's hand and stepped sideways. Not back, not forward, out of the script. We slid along the mossy wall, hand on rock, feet on roots, the creek at our ankles, where the path pretended not to be. The orbs tracked without moving, a terrible kindness. The voices followed, but softer now, like a radio in another room, halfway past. We found the place where the cleft drops to sharp rocks, the trick that almost took Caitlin before. We'd learned that one. We gave it distance. The largest tilted again, reading the geometry of our attention. The smaller ones fidgeted, and one of them rolled the knuckle bone over the stones in a cheerful little game that made my teeth ache. Play is how predators measure a room. It could have ended there, with our careful walk and their watchful hunger. But stories are economies, and debt collects. The largest stepped, one pace only, and the darkness flexed like a muscle around its leg. The blue lifted, the purple deepened, and for the first time I understood this part. The black wasn't a place. It was a permission, a curtain they bring with them to eat dinner without witnesses. "Stop," Caitlin said, not to them, to me. She squeezed my hand once and let go, then stepped forward 2 inches and spoke like she had a badge. "We see you," she said. We saw you then. We see you now. The voice that came back was not a theft. It was something older than mimicry. Then see, it said. The darkness thinned another degree. Not away, across. Behind the largest, between boulders, I saw a shape that did not fit. A boardwalk post, snapped clean, a tangle of rail wire, and something woven through it. Bits of fabric, a button, a child's plastic ring. Not a ritual, an accident's harvest. This was not a lair. It was a threshold where two careless architectures overlapped. The family ate at the seam. I don't know what mercy looks like in their language, but we were given some small portion of it. The largest reached down and touched the knuckle bone with one long shadow finger, and the little one who'd been playing with it went still. The voices went silent. The blue and purple dimmed to a tolerable cruelty. In that easier dark, I took Caitlin's hand again, and we walked, not running, along the remainder of the wall until the air forgot the flavor of them, and the river opened like a sentence we could finish. At the mouth of the gorge, we stopped and looked back. Ordinary shade again, ordinary trees, the waterfall performing for tourists who weren't there. A heron lifted from the far bank like a paragraph break. Caitlin let out a breath that had been holding her prisoner. "We didn't beat it," she said. "No," I said. "We were allowed to leave." On the way up, past the steps and the polite little sign about staying on paths, I saw a scrap caught in thorn. Blue plastic, sun-bleached toward white. I reached for it, and then didn't. Some souvenirs are boomerangs. We reached the boardwalks and found Chris there, after all. Hands in pockets, eyes on the river. He didn't ask what happened. He said, "Sorry, the way you say it, to the future," and started walking. We followed, grateful for the plain sound of shoes on wood. That night, in my old room, I lay awake and tried to count breaths without naming them. When the neighborhood settled and the small hours tested locks, a voice traveled the block. It did not say, "Hello?" or "Howdy?" It did not ask me to come check this out or spare a dime. It used my mother's tone and told me I'd left the back door open. I got up, heart doing that small wrong thing, and checked. The door was closed. I stood there with my palm on the cool wood and said to the empty kitchen, "We see you." The echo that came back didn't sound like triumph. It sounded like a receipt being printed, a debt tallied, a ledger balancing itself in ink I couldn't read. We weren't done. We were only current. The gorge had a table. The family had eyes. And now they had our voices, with the corners worn to our shape. The week after we were allowed to leave, life tried to return to its old choreography. It failed with grace. I kept thinking about thresholds, about places where two plans happen to the same square of earth. A path becomes a meal. A boardwalk post turns into a centerpiece. I made lists I didn't show anyone. Rails that end abruptly, fences that pretend, corners where shade chooses to be more than shade. Naming is a way to feel taller than what can swallow you. Caitlin and I built rules. Don't answer a voice you didn't invite. Don't bargain with what isn't asking. Walk sideways when the story demands forward, or back. If you must speak, say "We see you" and mean it. We wrote them on a card and then burned the card because paper is a kind of arrogance. Chris wouldn't talk about the gorge, but he showed up for other things. We studied together. We pretended the river was only water, and that winter was the honest reason our hands shook. Once, at a diner, I caught him staring at the salt packets and looked away first. Superstition is just grief with instructions. I started cataloging small wrongness. On the trail above the cut, a row of new signs about staying on paths. The association had paved a few slippery turns and added polite arrows. The improvements felt like apologies. Near the worst bend, there was a little memorial I hadn't seen before. Flowers in a jar. A photo once laminated, now gone cloudy. A charm bracelet tangled around the cap. No names I recognized. An accidents harvest. I thought of the knuckle shape I'd refused to name and swallowed the thought like a seed I didn't want to water. One evening, Caitlin texted, "Porch?" I walked over. We sat with our knees touching and shared a blanket against the early cold. Across the street, someone had added more LED strands, and that uncanny blue had colonized the eaves. "It's the same blue," she said. "Not exactly," I said, and then admitted. Close enough to teach my eyes the wrong lesson. We laughed at ourselves, because laughter is a doorstop. "I've been thinking," she said, and I braced. It didn't chase us. It measured us. It let us pass. Maybe it keeps park rules better than we do. That's one way to feel better about a family that eats with eyes, I said. She bumped my shoulder. "Everything eats. We pretend we don't. That's our religion." I told her about the memorial, and she went very still. "2 summers ago," she said quietly. "Kid from another subdivision. Fell. People said fence wasn't up to code." She didn't look at me. We always come back to the scene. The next morning, I did something I hadn't yet done. I called the association number on the email footer and asked for a ranger. I didn't say eyes. I didn't say voices. I said visual hazard, light anomaly, near total black in a narrow corridor. The man on the line told me shade can be dramatic in deep cuts, that atmospheric conditions can create pockets of poor visibility. He promised to send someone to evaluate signage. He was kind, which is another way to say helpless with training. That afternoon, I set up a recorder, not in the gorge, not even near it, but on my windowsill, with the window barely open, pointed toward the quiet half of the street where stories like to pace. I told myself I was doing science. I hit record and went to brush my teeth and let the device listen to what I pretend not to. In the morning, I put on headphones and pressed play. The night sounded like night. A car at distance, a stray bark, leaves making their small languages. Then, halfway through, a voice I knew too well. My mother's call about a back door I had checked. My own sorry tangled inside it. And fainter, a word that wasn't a word, like a match struck in another room. When the track ended, I sat very still and stared at my hands because they were trembling, and I needed to blame something obvious. I didn't take the recorder back to the gorge. I didn't need to. The lesson had arrived. They borrow what we leave out. Sound, shape, the map of our echo. We built the imitation by living. and the gorge signed its name at the bottom. One night, Caitlin wrote, "One more time. Daylight. A goodbye we say out loud." I said yes before common sense remembered its lines. We brought nothing that pretended to be a weapon. We brought a coil of rope we didn't intend to use, water, a pen, and 2 index cards. On mine, I wrote the rules again. On hers, she drew a simple table. She labeled it with a single word: family. We went when the clouds thinned, but the sun couldn't quite manage brightness. We took the steps, followed the rails, descended the familiar slope of dirt and roots. The waterfall put mist on our faces, like a blessing we hadn't earned. At the edge, where light sometimes chooses to be less, I stood with the card in my hand, feeling foolish in a way that meant I might be doing something right. "We're here to make an inventory," I said aloud, and if anyone had been near enough to hear, they would have decided I was the wrong kind of poet. "We won't answer voices. We won't be bait. We will walk sideways when the script wants forward or back. We will say, 'We see you,' and mean it." I placed the card on a flat rock and set my water bottle on it so it wouldn't blow away. Caitlin set her card beside mine. A little drawn table, empty plates, an empty bowl, a line under it like a tablecloth. For a long minute, nothing happened, which is the kind of mercy I best understand. Then the air altered the way a thought does when it decides to be a memory. The blue gathered itself, the purple answered, and a low arrangement of shadows collected. Not many, 3 small, 1 tall. It felt like a meeting, not a hunt. "We see you," Caitlin said. "Steady." I repeated it. The small ones shifted like children told to use inside voices. The tall one regarded us with the weight that makes a stone understand gravity. No tricks. No "hello?" None of the stolen phrasings. Just attention. A ripple moved through the black, a curtain opening an inch. The tall one indicated our cards with a tilt that was not a human gesture, and yet read as a question. I had brought a pen for this reason, or maybe for another I hadn't admitted. I bent, wrote beneath, "We see you. We will not follow if you call." Caitlin bent, drew a simple circle in one plate, and left the others blank. Silence can be a handshake. The tall one extended a long absence that felt like an arm and slid our papers an inch closer to the darker place. It didn't take them. It didn't shred them. It rearranged them the way you'd align cutlery before a meal. I wanted to ask for something. A promise, a boundary, a jurisdiction. But contracts require a court, and the gorge was not a court. So I did the only respectful thing I could think of. I stepped back and made room. Caitlin did the same. A small one rolled a pebble across the stones and followed it with delicate greed. The tall one did not move. We stood there until stillness felt like an answer. Then Caitlin lifted her card, folded it once, and tucked it into her jacket. I left mine on the rock, because rules belong where you say them. We walked the sideways path we had learned, and the dark did not follow, and the river accepted us without questions. At the rim, by the polite sign, we paused. "What did we just do?" she asked. "Wrote our names on a door we cannot open," I said. She took my hand and squeezed once and let go. Choreography complete. That night, there were no voices outside the window. I slept badly anyway. The only thing worse than a threat that visits is a threat that keeps its appointment and then decides not to knock. But I woke with a feeling I hadn't felt since the year before 7th grade, when sleep was still a place I lived. Not safety. No, but a truce that had my signature somewhere on it, in ink I couldn't read. We didn't win. We didn't lose. We made a line thin enough to step over and thick enough to notice. Sometimes a story ends not with a door slamming, but with both sides agreeing to keep it closed. Years slipped like careful footsteps. Campus turned into work, and work turned into a calendar that knew my name. I moved apartments twice, learned which streets forgive an insomnia walk, and which corners echo in unfriendly ways. I didn't go back to the gorge because I didn't need to know it was still there. Absence is just presence without eye contact. When the holidays came around, the neighborhood lit itself the way it always had. Caitlin sent a photo. A child she babysat making a paper snowflake, scraps everywhere. A circle cut wrong in the best way. Chris mailed a postcard with a river on it and wrote, "Only doing fine." I believed him halfway. On a city sidewalk in early evening, I passed a display window, crowded with LED strings. A vendor stood outside, offering samples that blinked through colors. One shade of blue paused too long against the glass, and my body remembered to be cold. I made myself stop. I watched it until the hesitation stopped being a threat and became a light again. I didn't flinch when silence tried my name in a familiar shape. You can practice not answering the same way you practice scales. I keep the index card in my desk. On it, the rules written in my hand, smudged where a raindrop insisted on being part of the story. Sometimes I take it out and read it like a weather report. We will not follow if you call. It's an agreement I make with myself as much as with anything else. There are days when I hear the wrong kind of hello. In a stairwell, in a parking garage, between shelves at the store, and I breathe and let the echo fall without catching it. There are nights when the window seems like a mouth, and I refuse to teach it my words. There are mornings when I look at a fence and imagine its future failure, and I text the council anyway to fix the loose rail. I think of the memorial flower jar, and I do not learn the name because grief doesn't need my curiosity to grow. Sometimes I dream of a table, simple wood, the plates empty, a bowl at the center with nothing in it. I wake with the scent of wet stone and the sound of water teaching the same sentence to the same rocks over and over. In the dream, I never sit. I stand in the doorway and say the only sentence I ever want to give them. We see you. In the dream, that is enough. When Caitlin visits, we walk edges that will let us, not cliffs. That's theater. We walk the line where park meets houses, where kids chase each other between fences that mean well. We don't talk about the family with eyes. And yet, every conversation is a translation of that day. We tell each other about jobs and headaches, and the way the future keeps acting surprised to find us in it. Every friendship is a map of what you survived together, and what you agreed not to point at too often. As for Chris, he learned a new mastery. Ordinary life As a shelter, you build plank by plank. When he does sarcasm now, it's the generous kind that takes your hand. He will never go into anything. I don't argue. I've finally understood that some promises are charm bracelets you wear until the metal forgets it once tried to be a chain once a year. When leaves slick the world and the air has that metallic taste, I write a letter I will never send. It starts with apology and ends with refusal. We will not follow if you call. I sign my name and leave it on the table overnight. In the morning, the letter looks exactly the same, which is to say, different in every way that matters. You want a last image. I know. A clean one to hang your fear on in the right-sized frame. Take this. I'm standing at a different river far from home. A gentle one that never saw a board walk. The afternoon is kind. People walk dogs, hold hands, throw sticks that never come back as weapons. In the eddy near the bank, I spot bones, small, ordinary, truly dear this time, lifted there by current. The sunlight makes them beautiful in the exact way that makes beauty an untrustworthy witness. I do not take a picture. I look until looking becomes thinking, and then until thinking becomes breath. And then I walk away at the apartment door that evening. I pause with my hand on the knob and listen. Not for danger, not for a voice, not for a theft of tone and syllable. I listen for the sound of a quiet that belongs to me. It arrives late, as usual, but it does arrive. When I sleep, I dream an ordinary dream, a hallway with all the lights working. Each room, just a room. When I wake, I write this down, because stories are how I pay what I owe you. If you came here for closure, I have only this honesty. We were not chosen. We were adjacent. We walked too near a seam in the world, and were measured, then permitted. That mercy lives under my tongue like a coin I don't spend. If you hear something that sounds like your mother, or your best friend, or the voice in your head that knows where the spare key is, pause. Count your breaths without naming them. Step sideways. If you must speak, say the sentence that cost us so much to learn, and mean it. We see you. Story number 3. I didn't go looking for ghosts to feel special. I'd been inspired by a season that pressed its weight against the walls of our high school. A season that smelled like old paper and rain on asphalt. Fear felt teachable, like a subject nobody asked for, yet everyone kept studying in secret. I told myself I was just taking notes. Halloween came, and I was a freshman with a heavy soda habit and a private audience of jittery listeners. My stories moved through the hallways like drafts from an open window, trading whispers for caffeine. If the world had gaps, I could feel them through the edges of other people's breathing. People said the house with the flickering ghost was a once-in-a-lifetime fluke. I didn't argue. But the strange beings that slipped through the gorge beside our neighborhood were proof enough that the supernatural could be as casual as a bus stop. Once you admit the dark is real, everything you do becomes a confession. I kept a subtle distance from everyone. I wasn't integrated into any groups. Not really. I floated, told intense, scary stories, and watched reputations swell and burst like soap bubbles. Detachment makes you brave. It also makes you a target. Then Caitlin began dating a soccer player, and the temperature fell 2 degrees inside my chest. Chris and I weren't speaking. We'd had a falling out after the incident at the gorge. You don't realize which friendships are scaffolding until you step off and hear metal clatter behind you. I didn't hate the school so much as I lived outside it. High school was just this white-walled place I went for 8 hours a day. It was a prison without bars, an allegory that refused to be allegory. I was bored out of my mind most of the time, and I fed that boredom by messing with people through horror stories. The season made them extra vulnerable to fear, and I learned how to tap it like a vein. Slow pressure, measured breath, a pause where a laugh should be. Power comes softly. The loud part is only the harvest. When Josh showed up, Caitlin's new orbit, I joined the team mid-season, even though I had no idea how to play. I wasn't extremely terrible, but my presence irked him on sight. I let my dislike show. Because sometimes the only way to survive a bluff is to go all in. Rivalry is a mirror you hold up until you can't tell which face is yours. The break came after practice. The front hall had that bleached, echoing emptiness the building gets after everyone goes home. Chris stumbled in, shoved from behind, Josh in his wake with 2 shadows, his cronies, and Caitlin. He tried to loom. I refused to bend. "I've heard all about your little stories," he said, angling for a stage. "Caitlin talks you up, but Chris says they're real, that it's you." Chris grimaced, apologized without words. He was depressed and morose, and if he needed to tell himself I confused people, I could let him have that. Some peace offerings are made of barbed wire. "Scare us," Josh said. "Find us a real ghost." His aim was Caitlin's attention. Mine was the thin wire singing under my ribs. I closed my eyes. The craft I'd been learning: collect the room, harvest the small sounds, tune them against that private string, pulled tight. When I opened them, something else tugged back. A blankness, gaps in the world, like cold patches on skin. I walked slowly down the hall, letting the fear rise like a dowser's rod, and it led us to the library. Inside, the light was November thin. We each took a book, as if the ritual had been written into us a long time ago. I sat mid-room. They made a long row. Josh next to me, Caitlin on the far side. I raised the book to my face until I could not see forward. They did the same, confused, snickering into the quiet. Fear adores geometry. It arrives by angles you refuse to check, attracted by an active imagination. I said, not to them, but to the posture we'd made. It uses an angle blocked by the book. It depends on the reader being immersed. Silence snicked into place. None of us could see forward. The body's defense was a periodic look around. We had disabled it on purpose. When you deny your own alarms, something else volunteers to watch you. So far, it has kept a low profile, I went on. It drains the psyche, leaves you tired and sore, though you were just sitting there, reading. Josh frowned. His friends traded glances they hoped were invisible. The quiet fattened until the air felt stored, saved up for something mean. I could sense the approach, a needle of presence finding the seam between our books and faces. "Now," I said. 6 potential victims at the same table are refusing to look. It feels threatened. It wonders whether to lash out. Tension sharpens best in restraint. Panic wastes the edge. The moment cinched tighter. Caitlin tensed. Chris looked extremely unhappy. I could hear a distant spool gathering speed, a thought I didn't want to claim. Then Josh slammed his book down. Breaking the line, the fear retreated, like something that had only been breathing with our permission. He called it crap. We lowered our books. The room felt re-inhabited by ordinary light, even if it still limped. If you can't deliver, he said, look somewhere else. Fine. If he wanted a stage, the gymnasium had a bigger one. We crossed into a giant, windowless darkness that arched like a void over our heads. A single wedge of hallway light failing to reach us. Two hauntings? Josh asked. I shook my head. The thing in the library isn't a ghost, I said. They're numerous, content to feed on minds that sit still and read. The danger is looking up too suddenly, or frightening it. Naming a monster is not the same as knowing it. Sometimes it only teaches it yours. We trekked across the floor. Our shoes wrote pale math on the surface. The farther we moved, the more the light behind us pinched down to two small squares. Laughter tried to rise and died too early to be called laughter. We're not supposed to be here, Chris said. We'll never reach the... And then we hit the wall. Oh. Caitlin looked back. Does that seem really far away to you? It's just a dark gym, Josh said, which is like calling a river just wet. Ahead eclipsed one square of light and vanished. One of the doors opened and shut, throwing a pale sheet across the floor that impossibly failed to touch us. Footsteps to the right, heavy, counted, then gone. To the left, lighter, fast, ending mid-breath. Silence pressed our shoulders forward. If something watches you and you cannot see it, you start answering questions it hasn't asked. We edged along the wall toward the outside door we remembered. The quiet swelled until it felt personal. I froze, not because of a sound, but because of breath. Warm, close, older. A voice near my ear said, "Hello?" And the word arrived stained with someone else's life. I didn't move. My heart worked a file against the link between seconds. I thought of the gorge and the way something there had looked back like it had paid to get in. Then motion tore the quiet. Light steps sprinting left, a heavier set lunging after, and the dark doors on that side ragged open. We stayed where we were, still and stupid. What was that? Josh said. But the question was less about facts than hierarchy. We turned as a group, not to be brave, but to prevent being alone. When courage fails, choreography takes its place. I wasn't hunting applause. I was trying to keep my center from sliding. The final encounter began after a soccer practice ended, when the building felt hollowed, and the sun had already chosen other rooms to live in. You can tell what a school really is, only after the lockers quit pretending to breathe. Most everyone had gone home. I stayed to rest in the front hall, counting steps I didn't plan to take. Sometimes you stall, not to save your strength, but to listen for the story, choosing you. The main doors jolted, and Chris stumbled inside, shoved from behind. Josh drifted in with two of his cronies, hard smiles, soft eyes, and Caitlin just behind them, apology written in the space around her mouth. He tried to tower over me, as if height could change genre. Bullies don't crave fear. They crave witnesses. I've heard all about your little stories, he said. Caitlin talks you up, but Chris says they're real, that it's you. Chris grimaced. Sorry, people can get confused. Grief rewrites blame in whatever ink it can find. Scare us, Josh said. Find a real ghost. He wanted a stage. I wanted the line I kept wounding in my chest to sing. I closed my eyes and let the craft I'd been building collect details, weigh surroundings, tune them against a string of fear. Tighten. I opened my eyes, and the hall felt cross-hatched with gaps. Little nothing places where air miscounted itself. I followed the pull, and we drifted toward the library. Inside, November light sifted itself too thin to be useful. I grabbed a book. They each took a book. We sat in a long row at the table, Josh next to me, Caitlin beyond him, Chris near the edge, as if the room could end early for him if he needed it to. I raised the book to my face until my forward vision went dark. They did the same. Uneasy laughter drying on the spines. Fear likes polite rituals. It attends when invited with quiet manners, attracted by an active imagination, I said, voice low enough to keep the room from thinking about it. It uses an angle visually blocked by the book. It depends on the reader being immersed and absorbed. We held still, obedient to the picture we'd made. So far, it has kept a low profile, draining the psyche, leaving you tired though you were just sitting there reading. Josh frowned. His friends traded looks they hoped were invisible. You can feel a presence most clearly where you accept a blind spot on purpose. Now 6 potential victims at the same table are refusing to look up, I went on. It feels threatened. It wonders whether to lash out. The air thickened, patient and predatory. Caitlin tensed. Chris looked extremely unhappy. The approach was a tensioned filament, almost audible. Then Josh slammed his book down, a choice shaped like a smirk, and the rising sense snapped back into lurking distance. This is crap, he said. There's nothing here. Come on. We lowered our books. The library exhaled into something ordinary again. If you can't deliver, fine, I said, and the word tasted like flint. I stood and led us out, letting the taut wire in my chest spark. The pull guided us to the gymnasium, a vast, open room shrouded in darkness, a windowless space arched like a drained cathedral. A single spike of light knifed in from the hallway doors and dissolved before it reached us. Big rooms make small people braver until the dark corrects the math. So there's 2 hauntings in the school? Josh asked. Unimpressed, I didn't answer him yet. I let the cold take inventory of our breaths. When the dark eats space, it starts with the corners of your vision. Then it gathers your shoes into a single, squeaking witness that isn't on your side. We trekked inward, and the 2 little door rectangles behind us shrank to postage. A joke tried to evolve and failed before the punchline. I could measure our nerves by the way we stepped, each of us leaving a small apology where the rubber met the floor. Keep your attention, I said. Let your eyes think you're looking, but actually listen. It was not a trick. It was an engine. The room wrote on it. The void learned our names by how we refused them. If it is here, I said, it prefers us arranged and undecided. That was my warning. It was also my invitation. A hush thickened the length of a hallway and then returned, pretending it had never left. Somewhere right of us, the suggestion of wait, not a sound so much as a posture. Left of us, a quick intent that rose, quit, and left its shape behind. What you call footsteps may only be your own fear trying to move without you. Stick to the wall, I said. Remember the door. We worked our way along the edge and touched cinder block. I was about to call it progress when the head eclipsed one of those distant squares of light, vanished. Then a door opened and shut. Pale light sprayed across the floor and refused to cross the distance to us. As if the dark had paid for naming rights, Josh breathed out annoyance on purpose, the way people do when they don't want you to notice the tremor. It's just a dark gym, he said. He was working very hard to turn a void into an opinion. Denial is only confidence with a head injury. I let him talk. The room liked him less the more he pretended it was a hallway with good posture. We drifted. Not farther, so much as deeper. The geometry changed. Longer than it was wide when we were hopeful. Wider than it was long when we weren't. That's when the breath arrived. A voice near my ear that did not belong to any class I'd ever taken. Hello? It said, carrying the warmth and rot of a stranger's life like a suitcase. I didn't move. I counted my heartbeat like filing rough metal. Then velocity. Light footfalls to our left, knifed toward the doors. Heavier ones exploded from beside me and went hunting. We stayed where we were, because staying is how you pretend you chose the fear. I turned, and the only plan I had was not to leave anyone behind. As a group, we folded toward the sound, because choreography sometimes passes for courage. We crossed the threshold. The doors we hadn't trusted slammed open again, this time with people in them. And we ran, Josh and his buddies ahead, me and Caitlin and Chris behind, until the hallway shook with our arrival. A girl's scream answered us, loud enough to leave itself on the paint. It was Lydia, a junior with student council posture, folded against the wall, while a man in rough sweaters and a cap tried to make her fear into something he could hold. The brawl was messy. A grab, a yank, Josh slamming, his friends dragging. And then the man broke free, glared, muttered sentences that had been evicted from sense, and bolted for the front door we'd left propped. Cold rushed in to replace him. We stood, stunned, confused, shaking. And all right, the hallway, delighted to be a hallway again, held us like it was owed money. I met Caitlin's eyes, then Chris's, and for a quiet second, nobody needed a ghost to explain anything. We were left stunned, confused, shaking. But all right. Relief is a bad historian. It edits too much. I remember the silence afterward, more than the shouting. The building settled back into being a building, and I stood there, counting the ways fear moves through a person and leaves all the doors open. The next day, we were subject to a series of lectures and interrogations about the incident. Adults turned concern into choreography and called it safety. The words were careful. The looks were not. Nobody asked why darkness knows our names better after hours. Nobody had been hurt, strictly speaking. But Lydia, staying after school for a project, had been scared half to death. She kept shaking her head like she could reorder events if she found the right rhythm. I didn't tell anyone that the worst part was the moment before the running, when we still believed the gym was only a box with bad lighting. None of us mentioned how we happened across her pursuer. Secrets feel noble when you convince yourself they're first aid. The teachers looked at Josh and then at me, and the glances met in midair like birds that didn't want to migrate anymore, highly disturbed by what had happened. Josh and his buddies left me alone after that, which is to say, the noise stopped, and the echo learned my name. I tried to accept the quiet as a gift, and not as a countdown. The single bright thing, bright being a generous word, was the one positive no one else noticed. Chris began speaking to me again. He found me in study hall, where the air holds its breath for an entire period. I was reading a book I wasn't ready to trust anymore. He sat, careful with the chair, careful with me, careful with what a friendship looks like after it's been dented every time, he said quietly, so that nobody else would hear our conversation. You seek these things, and there they are. It landed between us like a folded map. I wanted to argue with the compass, not the destination. I told him what I'd been telling myself, that the man in the cap was only a man, and the night had merely been a set with better lighting. A little shaken by the disturbed homeless man's attack myself, I just shrugged. Yeah, I said, but that wasn't supernatural. Saying it out loud made the line feel thinner under my feet, not thicker. I hate when certainty pretends to be humility. No? Chris replied. He didn't lean away this time. He leaned toward the question like it might be shy. You know, Brian had to go home this morning. He had a panic attack. Freaked out. His words were steady. The look in his eyes was not. I frowned. The kid was a known and annoying hypochondriac. Poor Brian, I said, trying to make compassion sound like punctuation. But the part of me that makes stories for other people had already stood up and crossed the room. He said he saw something, that it attacked him while he was reading. In the library. I didn't move for a second. Then I put my book down and slid it away, regarding it with sudden horror I couldn't convincingly hide. The weight of the hardcover felt like a dare I'd failed to notice before. Chris leaned in close, his eyes grim. The table between us turned into a narrow bridge, one step wide. No handrails. The afternoon buzzed on around us, busy and harmless in all the usual ways. Paper whispered, pencils measured small decisions. A clock insisted on pretending time was linear. None of it mattered, but you didn't tell anyone else that story, he said, not accusing, exactly, just drawing a circle on the floor and inviting me to look down at my feet inside it. He was right. I hadn't. I'd invented a ritual in the stacks and hoped it would only scare bullies. I hadn't considered the way attention can function, like a key you don't remember cutting. I walked my gaze across the spines on the far shelf. Histories. Manuals. The same horror paperbacks I used to study the weather of fear, like a meteorologist. If something in that room fed on focus, then our little performance had been a banquet. Attraction is physics before it is desire. We'd arranged ourselves, built the angle, offered the silence, and flattered it with belief. A librarian coughed in another universe, 3 tables away. I remembered Lydia in the hallway, remembered the man's breath, remembered how the gym made distances dishonest. Somewhere between cause and consequence, I had started thinking of myself as a map maker. But maps don't protect you. They just make you fluent in being lost. Chris didn't press. He just kept his hands open on the tabletop, like he was waiting for a small bird to choose them. "We should go in there," I said finally, but I didn't stand. There's brave and there's bait, and I'm tired of not knowing the difference. He nodded, and the nod meant not yet. The rest of the period took its time dying. When the bell finally released us, the hallway rushed by, all confidence and elbows. I kept my head down and counted the steps to the library, like rosary beads I didn't deserve. I didn't go through the doors. I only looked at them. It was enough to remember the geometry and feel my own mind moving, how focus narrows, how anticipation sweetens, how danger likes a polite invitation. If you're asking whether I believe in hauntings, I can only tell you this. There are days when I think the supernatural is just the natural, slightly better informed. And there are nights when I think stories are doors we build to walk through and blame the house for. That day, with Chris beside me, and a whole lot of normal pretending to be a school, I decided to stop pretending. I was only a storyteller. I was a participant. I had been all along. We left study hall together. No plan, just a quiet promise to listen better than before. To ourselves first. The building pretended not to notice. The doors to the library did what doors do best. And somewhere, in the slot between attention and appetite, something waited to see whether we would look up without warning. Story number 4. I was done pretending I could sleep. The halls, the gossip, the brittle laughter that cut like foil, all of it pressed in until the walls felt thin as paper. If danger wanted me, it would find me no matter how hard I pretended to be ordinary. I told myself a rule, simple as a locked door. The next move was clear. Forget about it, but forgetting has a pulse. It beats at the throat when the night goes quiet. It trembles at the edge of memory, where our encounters were purely bad luck, or something worse leaned in and listened. I wanted the world to be boring. I really did. I kept rehearsing a safer version of me. Soccer practice, late homework, cafeteria politics, no dead corners, no haunted rooms. It almost worked. Almost. Then the past sent its bill. Brian had told people what he'd seen, and that story grew teeth. Panic attacks began in classrooms that still smelled like dry erase and teenage perfume. Rumor spread like water under a locked door. I held the line, or tried to. I told myself that I had no gift, no curse, no compass for the dark. We couldn't be certain of anything except this. Forget about it and keep walking. I had reason. If things had gone a little differently during the disturbed homeless man's attack, Lydia might have been hurt, or worse. The school library had become a permanent center of rumor and uneasiness, and whispers settled there like dust on forbidden shelves. I didn't want to be the reason the lights flickered for anyone else, so I built a ritual of daylight, still sleeping poorly and staying up far too late. I wore my exhaustion like a jacket that didn't fit. I let my unending weariness dull my fear-tuned senses and drain my excitement for horror. traded goosebumps for grades, dread for drills, nightmares for neutral faces in crowded hallways. It's amazing what repetition can bury, until it can't, whether or not the universe was taking notes. They were certainly growing closer to home and more dangerous. I told myself a second rule: keep my head down, keep my mouth shut, keep my shadow small. Nothing hunts what won't run, but the heart cheats. It stashes maps where promises can't reach. On clear days, I heard the old static at the edges of the field, the way the bleachers seemed to inhale once, like a room remembering it used to be a chapel. I ignored it, the way you ignore a cough you don't want to name. Either way, my concern for the effect my fear-seeking was having on the people around me finally exceeded my inner resentment of school and the life I felt forced to slog through. There it was, the stubborn truth. I cared more about my friends not breaking than I did about being right about the dark. I thought that would save me. I tried to be a person who belonged. I put it all aside and got on with the circus of insanity that high school managed to perpetuate all by itself. Uniforms, carpools, the lined-up days. Brian had told people, and people had told other people, until it all sounded like a dare someone else had lost. I kept my eyes on the normal, and pretended the normal kept its eyes off me. We couldn't be certain what stalked the edges of our town, or whether our encounters were purely bad luck. But luck has a way of aging into pattern. And patterns don't forget the names of the ones who tried to walk away. I would learn this soon enough. When the road asked for a toll I didn't know I owed, I told myself I was cured. The field smelled like cut grass and rubber, and the sky over the bleachers held steady, in different light. I would learn the language of ordinary and speak it until the dark got bored. Turned out, I loved soccer. Maybe the trick was momentum. Run enough laps. Your pulse drowns out doubt. Keep the ball moving. Keep the story simple. I'd joined the team just to conflict with Josh, but he and Caitlin broke up, and we became amicable teammates. Time did its dissolving. Gossip thinned. The haunted edges of town withdrew like a tide. I practiced forgetting the way people practice free kicks. The longer nothing weird happened, and the longer I refused to think about horror or tell stories, the more everything faded. But memory keeps receipts. The very public stories of the house beyond the edge and the homeless man's attack became humorous memories. Laugh at a wound long enough, and it learns to smile back. Even so, a role forms around whatever you survive. They lost their realness, and I became regarded as a normal teenager, for better or worse. I wore that role like a rented suit, fitted, wrong, and due back by midnight. Nothing headline-worthy happened. Nothing of relevant note happened for nearly 2 years. I learned routes between classrooms that avoided certain doorways, learned to treat silence like a corridor I could walk down without turning my head. But beneath the hall traffic, a different tournament played out. I'd become wholly engaged in the constant battle for fulfillment and position that high school entailed. Even if I didn't seek the same groupthink that everyone else seemed to, I preferred the edges. The edges remembered me, so I built a name on friction. I based my reputation, as always, on being set against and apart from everything else. Caitlin went the other way, smiling into the crowd like sunlight on chrome. Caitlin chose the opposite route, It wasn't a phase for her. Her dating a soccer player was not a one-time thing. Lines were drawn in soft pencil, erasable in theory, permanent in practice. This often set us at odds in subtle and unhappy ways. We learned to step around them, the way you step over cracks you claim not to believe in. Chris tried a different medicine, denial in a Letterman jacket. Chris slowly got over the things that had happened by pretending they hadn't. He campaigned for a future he could count. Titles, teams, bullet points. He followed a similar path to Caitlin's by pursuing leadership in band, the math team, the chess team, and student government. And because life is good at quiet wars, this led to a latent but powerful strain between the three of us. We didn't talk about it. We wore it. It rode with us in the car like a fifth passenger with foggy breath. Then came the dance, our calendars, crown and joke. By the time the homecoming dance of 11th grade rolled around, I had my driver's license, and Chris had been dating Caitlin for a week. I smiled where it showed, and winced where it didn't. That bothered me for reasons I obviously couldn't vocalize. I also had a girlfriend, proof that hearts can be crowded houses. I had a girlfriend of a month at the time, so it shouldn't have mattered. But on paper, we were fine. Paper burns, still. On paper, we were loyal. On the surface, we were all still the best of friends. We followed the plan the way people follow maps that leave out rivers. Per the plan for the dance, I picked the two of them up. My girlfriend's house was the next stop. We looked the part. Clad in rented suits, Chris and I bantered back and forth, both attempting a Sean Connery accent and throwing out James Bond quotes. Meanwhile, the car felt like a stee with the curtain stuck halfway. While extremely pretty in her dress, Caitlin stayed quiet, looking out the window. Her reflection rode beside her. Two girls, one silence. The radio tried to sell us harmless songs. The dashboard offered warmth like a bribe. Outside, fall thinned the light and threaded the wind with teeth. The evening was a little nippy, with mid-October chills, and Halloween season was upon us. But I ignored it all, intent on driving safely and having a good time. Inside, the air changed its mind, because peace at 17 is a rumor. The map was correct, until the road decided it wasn't. The suit fit until it didn't. I kept the wheel straight and told myself the night would honor the promise of being ordinary. I was wrong, but that's a later sentence. What mattered now was the hush before a storm you can't name. 3 breaths, 1 engine, and an aisle of black trees ahead, like pews before a sermon you don't want to hear. I tightened my grip and pretended I believed in detours that led back to where you started. We hadn't even reached the second stop when the air in the car thinned. The night pressed close over the windshield like a dark hand, and the road ahead narrowed to a ribbon of reflected lines. I told myself we were just kids in formal clothes and borrowed bravado. Then Caitlin leaned forward and asked, "Do we really have to pick up Nicole?" Chris shot me a look that said, "Don't start." I kept my eyes on the center line, but the words kept swinging like a slow pendulum. Some questions aren't questions. They're lit fuses. Caitlin added, "We should just go to dinner ourselves." I tried humor, because humor is the cheapest bandage. I laughed, a small negative undercurrent beneath my positive exterior. I said something about being on a schedule, about being decent, about plans. None of it mattered. The match had touched the wick. She pushed again. Soft voice, sharp edge. She's just kinda stupid, you know? The words were a neat cut, the kind that bleeds later. Chris's tone went flat, a storm shelf forming at the horizon. Not this again, he said. You do this to every girl he's interested in. Her hands rose. A shrug that felt like a shove. Not my fault if he goes after the stupid ones. The insult sat in the cabin air like a ghost that refused to fog the glass. I checked the mirror, held Caitlin's reflected gaze, and said, "Stop." She dropped her eyes. "Whatever," and turned back to the window, the world sliding past in cold sheets of suburb and shadow. What I wanted was simple. Pick up my date. Keep the peace. Let the night be ordinary. But ordinary wouldn't sit still. The engine hummed its neutral hymn while nerves tuned themselves to a higher key. Every mile marker felt like a countdown. Houses thinned. Trees traded places with fences. I signaled, eased over, and pulled to a stop at the curb. I walked to Nicole's front door while they argued in the car. The words, a muffled storm behind glass. Nicole opened to the camera-ready page of the evening, dress catching the porch light, a perfume that wanted to be a promise, a smile that asked me to ignore how late we already were. If the night had a hinge, it turned here. I felt ridiculous in my suit and suddenly protective in a way that embarrassed me. She took my arm, and for a handful of heartbeats, the world pretended to be gentle. Back in the car, the temperature shifted by degrees. Caitlin's gaze cut to the side. Chris studied nothing in particular. Nicole offered a compliment that was also a dare. The cabin filled with brief, tactical sentences, the kind that look polite until you add them together. I kept the wheel steady and the speed safe, letting the tires hum like a mantra. Keep it moving. Keep it narrow. Keep it away from the edge. But disrespect has a way of breeding in the ductwork. A comment about grades. A comment about looks. An echo of, "You're really smart," and she's just not. I watched it happen in the mirror, the way a face learns to harden and then pretends it didn't. I thought of the library and its rumors, of the way panic can hop hosts like a spark across dry fields. We had brought our own kindling. The restaurant was all candle bulbs and chrome, a place that staged happiness every 45 minutes. We played our parts badly. Jokes that died. Forks that clinked too loud. The server who kept arriving at the worst sentence. I tipped well, as if money could bribe fate. Outside, the sky had sunk into a deeper bruise. Halloween sat in the season like a coin under the tongue, metallic and mean. On the way back to the car, the wind caught Nicole's hem, and she laughed without sharing it. Chris walked ahead, the way you do when you want to give space and take it at the same time. Caitlin fell into step beside me, and for a second, we were kids again, standing on the thin ice of our old loyalties. I wanted to tell her to stop poking holes she couldn't swim through. I didn't. We pulled onto the road that stitched town to dark. The neighborhoods faded like old photographs. Porches blinked out one by one. The farther we went, the more the world thinned between gas stations, pockets and gaps, bright and black. I felt the first familiar pressure at the edge of thought, that quiet radio hiss I'd trained myself to ignore. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself a lot of things. The voices rose again. A compliment that was really a claim. A defense that was really a dare. At the passenger seat, the girls shifted, shoulders knocking, the way orbiting bodies eventually collide. The rear view showed Chris's jaw set like stone, a statue built by a sculptor who never learned mercy. You can't referee a storm once it starts making its own rules. Up ahead, the road pinched where the trees leaned in. The black beyond the high beams looked thicker, darker, as if the night had clenched a fist. I slowed, without admitting I had, blinked the brights as if that would thin the dark. The argument hit a higher octave, hands gesturing too close to the dash. Something in me flinched the way a horse flinches at lightning it can't see. I felt the wound of the world opening a few car lengths ahead, a thinning that smelled like wet bark and old water. I braked hard enough to earn 4 gasps and a silence. Tires found gravel. The car angled as if surprised. We skidded to a halt in a pocket of trees that had no business being this close to the road. The night listened. Raindrops found us in a slow, testing way, as if the sky wanted to know our names before it decided what to do with us. For a count of 10, I could hear everything. My pulse, their breath, the piping hiss of wet leaves, the tick of heat bleeding out of the engine. I let the wheel go, hands open, as if that would persuade the dark I meant well. From the back seat, Chris whispered a question, without a mark on the end of it. Nicole stared straight ahead, and the glass gave our fear a frame. Caitlin was the first to move, shoulder harness snapping away, fingers on the handle. "Don't," I said, but she was already opening her door to the light rain, already letting the cold find her. The smell of leaf rot arrived in a low tide. The forest stood arranged as if a stagehand had dragged it closer during a blackout. I told myself this was just a bad turn and an overreaction. I told myself it was the weather, the season, the fight. But the old ache at the edge of my awareness had already pivoted, pointing past the trees and into whatever didn't want to be named. I could feel the map inside me changing scale, the way river lines swell when you zoom too far in. The road was behind us. The night had other plans. When Nicole opened the door, the porch light turned her into a headline. Beauty is a kind of weather. It changes the air before anyone speaks. I felt the night tilt, as if our plans had slipped an inch towards somewhere I couldn't name. I told myself to be decent, to be the driver who keeps the temperature steady. But the heart keeps a score the mouth won't read aloud. Behind me, I could already sense the geometry of glances rearranging the cabin of the car. We crossed the yard in a hush padded by lawn and perfume. Moments like these are supposed to be easy. 4 kids, 1 evening, a map drawn in marker. I knew better, but knowing doesn't always beat hope. Inside the car, silence wore a smile with teeth. Politeness bends. It doesn't break until it does. I started the engine and felt the evening tighten, like a tie that was never fitted for my throat. She looked amazing in her dress, better than Caitlin, and she knew it. She was a cheerleader, prided herself on her appearance. Caitlin was right. Truth is a blade you only notice after it draws. I wasn't blind to the math of it. I was very smart. Nicole and I often had moments of total misunderstanding. But she was a fine person, not a riddle to be solved. A person to be carried carefully through a night people love to ruin. And I wasn't innocent. I'd narrated the world too sharply for too long. It had learned to narrate me back, in that mirror glass way teenagers do. We all kept catching reflections we didn't want. I gripped the wheel a little tighter and made friends with the white lines. Once back in the car, the first gentle strike landed. Praise disguised. Comparison loaded. Nicole answered with grace, sharpened at the edges. Words started lining up like dominoes you pretend you won't push. The restaurant received us with warm bulbs and tired music. The subtle arguments and stinging comments continued through dinner at the restaurant. Our waiter drifting in and out like a referee who didn't know the rules. Chris tried for détente. I tried for timing. Caitlin tried not to try, somewhere between the appetizer and the part where you pretend to love the main. The tide reached the booth. The tablecloth was a map of restraint. Our silverware little flags, we moved without winning ground. I could feel my voice thinning into something careful and useless. A text buzzed. Another laugh landed wrong, and I watched our courage file out the door. There's a sound a room makes when it agrees to host a fight. A soft drop in pressure, as if the air wants to leave before you do. The menu's promises tasted like cardboard. It wasn't about Nicole's dress, or Caitlin's precision, or Chris's diplomacy, or my habit of narrating the weather inside my own head. It was about the bruise we'd all been pressing since freshman year, the one that matched the shape of the unknown we'd met and tried to forget. When you won't talk to the dark, you talk at each other. The check arrived, wearing a smile of math. I tipped well, as if money could pay off omens. On the way out, the door hissed a colder draft across the floor, and I knew the woods were waiting somewhere between town and the dance, where the light thins and the old roads remember older names. On the sidewalk, Nicole's hand found my arm. Behind us, Caitlin and Chris paced the cadence of a truce that wouldn't hold. We were beautiful in that ugly, truthful way teenagers can be. Fragile, opinionated, terrified of being ordinary. I looked up. The clouds marched across the sky like a cover being pulled, and the moon didn't argue. Comments gathered like moths around the last things we said in the parking lot. Headlights sketched us into moving pieces. I started the car, swallowed whatever speech I was about to make, and aimed us toward the margin of town. Dinner was a blur of unhappiness, and the night, patient as a closed gate, was ready to test which of us still believed in detours that lead home. Rain stitched the windshield in restless silver, thin lines crossing like anxious veins. Inside, we held our breath as if that might quiet the night listening outside the glass. Some places don't want cars. Some places want feet. Little dots appeared on the windshield, and I could see flickering lines of rain through the high beams like threads pulled through dark cloth. The forest had a way of arranging itself into a room. Pillars, ceiling, aisle. I felt the invitation and the warning braided together. the stunned moment passing. I sensed Caitlin looking around. She asked what I'd done, as if I'd cast a spell by breaking too hard. Chris put his forehead against his window, suddenly certain this was the kind of night that keeps a ledger. I checked the mirrors and found only trees where a road should have been. The darkness out there set the sense inside me, vibrating with an almost physical force. We were bracketed by trunks stained red in my brake lights, boxed in by old growth and new dread. Then doors opened the way a thought opens, without permission. "Stay in the car," Caitlin said, and then stepped into the rain. "Don't go out there," Chris breathed. But we were already choosing the kind of mistake you can't undo. Curiosity, with cold water in its shoes. We stood among thick, ancient trees, a carpet of leaves underfoot. No underbrush to snag us, just a cathedral of trunks and the wet whisper of rain. Old growth all around, a place where the road was nowhere to be seen. Somewhere between maps, you realize the world doesn't owe you exits. "Where are we?" she asked. I had nothing that sounded like an answer. Parallel nightmare, time folded, or just the part of the county that doesn't admit asphalt? Is this some parallel nightmare reality? Or did we go back in time or something? The rain clicked softly on leaves, and the answer chose to be a secret. We decided on elevation. "Looks like there's a hill over there, so we should go climb it and look for the road." Headlights stayed behind like a tether we kept promising not to break. I pulled the keys out, silencing the engine, leaving only the bright cones of light to comb the trunks. Sound grew teeth when the engine died. Without the rumbling sound from the engine, the forest became much louder. The wet hush complicated by an occasional unexplained snap or crack in the dark. Every unseen branch was a question mark with a pulse. We moved in the beam until the beam dissolved. Eyes adjusted. My only hope was that some sort of road would be visible from up the slope. A necklace of street lights to prove the mundane still existed. The hope thinned as the dark learned our names. Something stepped to the left, just past the place where sight becomes suspicion. I had sudden flashbacks to the pitch-black gymnasium, to waiting for breath that wasn't mine to touch my face. Terror is a muscle. It remembers its shape. "Chris, watch our left. Caitlin, watch the right. Nicole, scream if you see anything weird." The shapes sharpened by subtraction. I found myself barely able to make out forms and shapes, lit by the barest moonlight spotting the floor of leaves. Then a branch noticeably bright red, rather rotted, and resting at an odd angle, slid behind a trunk. It had been a leg. I caught Nicole's scream with my hand, and my own with the other. "Back to the car," Chris hissed. The map in my chest disagreed. "No? Forward. Just run." Panic is a language we were suddenly fluent in. Feet found traction on wet leaves. Knees found gravity. We lifted each other the way people do when there isn't time to vote on the plan. Snaps kept pace, then lost it, replaced by a strange hissing, breathing sound that wanted to be behind us and ahead of us at the same time. The ground tilted up. We took the hill, hearts drum tight. "Lights!" Caitlin pointed. And there they were, an unidentifiable building and a brightly lit gas station. And a road. Then the wind told the truth. The horizon had been hinting. The hill dropped to a wide, flat, murmuring black plain. A river shoulder to shoulder with the dark. No, 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 Chris shouted. A river? No. The woods behind us answered with a dozen crackling and breathing sounds. I can't swim, Nicole said, and for a breath, the night almost smiled. It'll ruin my dress. Caitlin fixed the math with mud and a curse. Humiliation is a raft if you throw it fast enough. We splashed in and the river took our heat like a tithe. I have always hated water I can't see through. The ice cold brought pain and a certain irresistible terror. A childhood certainty that the dark beneath has hands. It did. A low sound similar to a chuckle bled across the surface, and the silhouettes that followed wore rotting like a uniform. They looked like mauled corpses, mostly an assortment of animals, but one vaguely human. Go! I yelled, fighting clothes that didn't want me fast. The water flattened distance. Sound traveled mean. Ahead of the three of us, Nicole screamed, My leg! I dove under, cold, knifed every thought into one. Don't breathe wrong. Fingers, a bony, slimy hand had her ankle. I took 2 fingers in each hand and pulled apart. The hand ripped in half. We broke surface to a chorus of our own lungs. They're in the water. We knew. We swam. The things under the water gripped at us and swatted for limbs. But fear is a motor, and we had it set to burn. The shore across was waiting. Corpse silhouettes, watching as if patient ushers at the wrong theater. We stalled into tread, and despair creep-weighted our shoulders. We can't get out. We can't escape, Chris said, offering the apology people give before they drown. It's fine, man. It wasn't. But friendship counts even when math doesn't. What are those things? Nicole's voice shook. Caitlin's froze. I looked at the river like it had a mind and found it looking back. I asked the only question that ever bought me a map. Are you scared? Yes. Nods like verdicts. Then let's just float downriver for a little. See what comes up. We let the current write our next sentence. The shambled things trailed us along the shore, counting our shivers, waiting for the cold to finish the work. And yet, there were blank spots in my fear. Holes like absent teeth. Just a few. All on one side of the river. The side with the gas station glow. I ignored the blanks and listened to the terror that had always told the truth about deep, unknown water. Back across, I rasped. We aimed for the forested shore. The humanoid corpse laughed and slid its pack into the water to beat us there. A pressure rolled under me, like a muscle turning in sleep. Back, back. We turned toward the lights again as the river behind erupted. Thrash and churn we dared not watch. We scrambled ashore, lungs rioting. Caitlin grabbed my wrist and pointed. The river dimpled into a barely discernible depression, a whirl of black with uncanny force, a throat in the water. What is it? She asked. I gave the guesses. Fear gives, when it wants you to live. A sinkhole under the river, some sort of creature, hiding under there, feeding on animals. I don't know. Either way, it scared me, and fear had been right all night. We stood on gravel and breath, drenched and shaking. while the river wrote circles over the place we might have been taken. Some dangers end like a trap door. You only realize you've crossed it when it's behind you. Just like that. The danger was over. Caitlin held my wrist, as if the current might change its mind. The parking lot's sodium light painted us a cheap gold. Somewhere, a compressor hummed like a tired choir. We didn't laugh. Not yet. Survival has a silence before the jokes arrive. Chris came running from the gas station, face pale and eyes bright with mischief. He built a joke to fit the hole terror had left. "It's worse than you can imagine," he gasped. Then, "We're in Western Virginia." We pushed him, and we laughed because we had to. The laugh made room for breathing again. Business followed terror, the way invoices follow storms. That building beside the gas station, it's auto repair. The dude will help us tow our car to the road. We're near somewhere called Blacksburg and Claytor Lake. Names reattached us to maps. Warm air from the garage heater found our bones and asked them to stop ringing. The drive back would take over 5 hours. Nicole's anger settled into a steady weather front. We missed homecoming, as if the night had simply been a scheduling error. Chris unfolded a big map the mechanic handed over. Its creases like fault lines. This river splits a few times, but it runs all the way up right near where we live back in Ohio. Think that's important? I watched the road and listened to the river. We couldn't see, miles away, and somehow inside the car. Weird, I said. I don't think so, unless you're afraid of potential river monsters. Then the map folded inside my head. Wait, is it the river? The one the gorge runs to? And the school is near it. And the house beyond the edge was... Some answers are better as questions that keep you awake. We argued with coincidence. I can't tell. Me neither. I knew Virginia without knowing it. Not this town, but these trees, this slope of ground, this feeling that the wilderness arrives right up to the edge of suburbs and says boo without saying it. I did also live in Virginia before I moved to Ohio. I recognized this kind of forest immediately. Chris looked at me in the rear view, like a detective holding a puzzle with one piece left. You mean you know the area? No, never been here. I mean the details, the landscape. We turned off the road in Ohio and ended up somewhere else in the world. But it was somewhere you were familiar with? What's the chance of that? The question hung between us, like a bridge we were afraid to cross. Caitlin leaned forward, grinning. Can we play with this now? I've been waiting years. It's obvious you can't ignore it now. She had mud on her dress, like battle paint. The night had crowned her with a dare. I kept the wheel straight and the heat high. Wanting answers is one thing. Paying for them is another. We could have died out there, I said, glancing at Nicole, sleeping unhappily in the passenger seat. Mascara like ghosted bruises. Maybe, Caitlin said. But the mystery is there, whether you want it or not. It's time to figure out what's really going on. The window was down an inch, so the night could tell me what it remembered about us. I let my senses run the landscape, like fingers over braille. The history of our wrong turns raised 1,000 small questions that all sounded like one. Is any of this real? Were we just sharing intense imaginings? I didn't answer out loud. The tires answered for me. Mile, mile, mile. Then the night collected itself into a small, disgusting fact. Something squirmed in my lap, having fallen out of some tuck in my ruined dress clothes. Instinct split me into two people, the one steering and the one recoiling. I grabbed the disgusting thing, and the road blurred an inch to the left before the wheel knew my hands again. I held it up where the dash light could confess it. A moldy, red, rotting finger, soft as a word you don't want to say. Proof is an ugly gift. I hurled the moldy, red, rotting finger out the open window. The wind took it without argument, and somewhere behind us, the river, or the thing in it, counted one less. After that, nobody spoke for a while. 4 survivors in a warm car, rolling through counties that slept like nothing had happened. The map rattled softly on Chris's knees. Caitlin watched the trees try to outrun us and fail. Nicole dreamed a better dance. I kept my eyes on the stripe that splits the world and pretends it knows which side is safe. The truth? I don't know if we left a road and found a door, or if a door found us and pretended to be a road. I know rivers remember, and so do forests, and so do people who tell themselves they're done being haunted. We made it home, which is not the same as being safe. End story number 5. I didn't pick the river tonight. I drove. While Caitlin sat in the passenger seat and Chris lounged in the back. We needed a place far from our hometown, somewhere the water couldn't take the blame. We'd pored over maps until coffee stained the margins. We'd spread out the maps and drawn up a dozen theories. Was the pattern tied to currents and shorelines? Or was it me? The plan was simple. Head for hills where families hike, where birds rehearse dawn in low branches, where nothing bad should happen by design. Yet the moment we hit the trees and the sun disappeared behind heavy canopy, the air changed texture, as if the forest were smoothing our thoughts with wet leaves. Something was ahead, not cruel, but tilted, like a house built a degree off level. That way, I said, and both of them heard the strain in my voice. The trail switchbacked through uneven, forested terrain, random cliffs shouldering out from ferns and black earth. Paths made the popular area safe for hiking, and it was still early enough to catch echoes of laughter from a parking lot crowded with cars. A toddler in a red hat tugged at a sapling and giggled. I made myself look away from the hat, because bright colors had started to feel like bait in my life. What's it feel like? Caitlin asked. I listened, not just to wind, but to pattern, to the quiet arithmetic that sometimes curled under the bark of the world. The leaves moved with rhythm, and dappled sunlight slipped like coins through the cool mid-October air. It's strange, but not dangerous, I said, surprised to hear the word and know I meant it. Awesome, Chris said, though his shoulders stayed tight. For once, we followed the pull until we passed along the top of an abrupt 40-foot cliff, an old basin stained with an old waterfall's memory. 2 little kids waved at us from below, while their parents framed the scenery. I waved as well, and a shard of guilt slid under my ribs. If I was about to find a new kind of wrong in the world, I wanted it far from small hands and birthday shoes. Then we saw it, a cleft in the rock itself, the opening skewed, like a grin held at the wrong angle. The rough, tangled terrain above permitted no other access, the walls devoid of moss and lichen, stark gray rock against stark blue sky. The air inside felt warmer, as if the place were a flat creek bed, abandoned by its maker. "That isn't dangerous?" Chris asked. "It's not angry," I said. "Just off. The way a mirror feels when you realize the thing in it knows your intentions." We slid into the shade and then into glare, leaving the mid-October chill behind, sweat needling our temples. The gully tightened, and we came to a split. The left route, a snarl of broken rock and narrow walls. The right, as smooth and careless as a flat creek bed. I wanted sunlight, breath, a quick out. "Let's go." "Right," I said. A few minutes later, we emerged from the cleft's exit. I blinked at the trees, at tire dust a few steps away. "Wait," Chris said, turning. "Isn't this where we went in?" Caitlin frowned. I saw our old footprints in the soft dirt. She traced one with a finger, then straightened, eyes glinting. "So the place doesn't just hold space, weird. It folds it in a loop." We walked forward to come back. I felt myself relax a degree. At least we know it's not the river now. We slung our backpacks down and set our minds to staying the night. Because if the world was going to reveal a cruel seam, night was the seam ripper. The park would close at sunset, which made us unwelcome, and therefore real. The forest cooled into a silent bowl. I woke to bark digging into my spine and the cold icy enough to make my teeth feel like rocks. Something was climbing the hill inside me. An approaching sense of violence and hunger walked around my heart and tested the doors. "Up," I whispered. "Wake up!" Caitlin rubbed her eyes. Chris sat up so fast, he knocked a pine cone across the needle bed. "When did we fall asleep?" Voices echoed from further up the slope, thin as radio from another county. Caitlin peered into the trees. "Everyone's supposed to be gone." We moved like thieves back to the cleft's entrance. The voices were coming from inside, and then from out, as 3 people exited under moonlight, dressed like a memory you keep in the top drawer. One of them laughed in Chris's exact rhythm and said, relieved. I thought we'd never get out. The real Chris, my Chris, grabbed my sleeve so hard his knuckles went pale. "What the?" Caitlin's whisper shook. "Are they us?" I remembered the angle at the split, felt it like a bruise I'd pressed earlier. "I think these are the versions of us that went left instead of right," I said. And the universe hates unfinished symmetries. The hunger in my chest suddenly spiked. I looked up. From the canopy, delicate and nearly invisible fibers drifted like dandelion clocks, settled, and then snapped back, dragging our doppelgangers upward. They began screaming, and then the screams muffled quickly. Silence fell. Chris breathed through his teeth. "Something's got them." "That's what it does," I said, and the words tasted like old metal. "It waits for this duplication trick to happen. The doubles come out at night, and once the tourists are gone..." "What?" Chris shook my shoulder. "And then what?" "Then it shops," I said. "And it always gets a cart with perfectly good wheels." Caitlin swallowed hard. "I think we have to go after them. They're us." I watched the shape of the leaves shift, as if blown by wind. But there was no wind, just intention. It's moving away. Let's follow it. I think it doesn't know we're here. We're not supposed to be here after hours. We moved when it moved. rushing along whatever cover we could find, slowing when the forest held its breath. I kept my body between them and the tree line, as if opting for a double dinner was a choice I could block with ribs and hope. The shape stopped suddenly. We knelt. Something wet and bone-thin slid down a trunk and folded itself into the mouth of a small cave. A minute later, it clambered back up and dragged the night over itself like a blanket. The breeze-like shifting drifted down slope. Hunting again. Caitlin looked at me. I nodded. We slid down into the cave. The smell was overpowering, like roadkill, multiplied by loneliness. It's safe now, I told Chris, and only then did he flick on the flashlight. That was a mistake. The beam ran down a tunnel lined with bodies in various stages of decay. There were hundreds, maybe even thousands. Death had learned how to stack itself like cordwood. How could this happen without anyone knowing? Chris whispered. It just takes the doubles at night. Once everyone's gone, nobody's missing, so nobody has a clue, Caitlin said, the words pushing past her hand. Movement stuttered in the dark. Chris swung the light and found 4 long, white lumps, mummies made of gluey silk. We ran over, tearing, grabbing rocks, sawing. We uncovered a stranger first, a man with panic carved into his face. "Oh God! Oh God!" he shouted. I got his attention back into the cave. Quiet. I tried to use a voice that could hold a person together. We freed enough of his neck to see the truth. I met his eyes, so he wouldn't have to look down. "What do we do?" Caitlin asked, voice contorting with resisted tears. I inhaled and tasted dust. "Your skin's missing, and your legs missing." I swallowed. "I think it's been eating you." He shook, then nodded, sweat pouring from his forehead. "It stuck me with something," he said, "and then I felt it chewing, but it didn't hurt. I thought, maybe." The rest crumbled. "If we leave you, will you scream?" I asked. Probably. I couldn't finish the sentence that followed. He finished it for me with a request and a name and an address and a daughter. I said, "Got it memorized?" He asked. "You sure?" I said. "I've got a good memory." I cut near the missing leg the way he asked. The silk loosened, and blood flowed out in a steaming wave, running toward the dead as if it had business with them. He shivered, and then he didn't. "Did he just die?" Caitlin asked. Chris froze. "Just hurry," I said, pulling the world into a smaller, meaner shape. We turned to the other 3 cocoons, and when we freed the heads, we saw our own faces looking back. "Are you guys us?" the other Chris blurted. "Wait, it doesn't matter. There's this thing. It got us." "We saw it," our Chris said, sawing at the silk, face paper white. "Come on," the other Caitlin said. "Get us out of here." Her eyes kept cutting to me, asking a deeper favor than simple rescue. The other me didn't beg. He studied me the way a surgeon studies an X-ray. "I know why he's not moving," he said to his partners. "He's counting forward." "Counting what?" the other Chris demanded. "What's going to happen if they save us?" my double asked. "Which group is the original? Who gets our lives?" I wanted to spit out a brave sentence. What came instead was the little truth with sharp edges. There's no way to know. We're probably both exactly the same. Caitlin's hands slowed on the fibers. Chris looked from me to me, stuck between two cliffs, with the same voice echoing off each. "No," the other Chris said, begging now. "Free us. We'll sort it out later. We'll change names. We'll run. Whatever you want. You can't do this," the other Caitlin pleaded, eyes on the version of me who had any power. "We'll leave town tonight. We'll take the left roads, the long roads. We'll disappear." I wanted to be the sort of person who believed in roads. But the thing in the trees believed in roads too. We dragged a large boulder into place outside and crouched behind it. My stomach went electric. The creature returned, its legs skittering down the tree, a carcass folded in its grasp like a sum of bad choices. It slid into the cave. The screams began shortly, muffled quickly, and then the noise turned into a hush tangled with damp. We ran. We tore our bodies on branches that had never meant to be weapons. We broke the night with hips and elbows and disgrace. We left all of our gear back at the makeshift campsite, because some possessions know when they are not welcome anymore. By the car, Caitlin folded against the door and sobbed. "I was the one who wanted to play with this, like it was a toy. And now," words turned heavy in my mouth. I could feel the other me, somewhere above underground, struggling against tight silk, being slowly eaten piece by piece. And he'd known, the instant he saw me, what choice I would make. "It's not just on you, man," Chris said, crying and talking around his snot. We all agreed. What would our parents say if another set of us showed up? How would we live? How would we explain any of it? I nodded, because breathing required fewer verbs. Time grew around the decision like scar tissue. In the weeks after, fantasies found me on straightaways. Lure the thing, slam the throttle, crush its clockwork bones, burn the cave clean. But I never did go back. Instead, I did what cowards and clerks do. I found the address the stranger had begged me to visit. I waited near it in my car, as if patience could launder what I'd done. A school bus sighed to a stop. A little girl leapt off and ran toward her house, and the man who greeted her with a tired wave was the same man I'd watched bleed out in the corpse-filled cave. He lifted the girl, the scene playing like an ad for a country I'd never afford. He was oblivious because he wasn't the he I'd watched. He was the version who had wandered into the cleft and left before night reprinted him. A life with no machinery under it. A life with small chores and taller joys. Back in my own house, the mirrors developed different opinions about me. Every reflective surface tried to do math. How many naturally weird spots in the world led to accidental duplications? How many intelligent creatures learned to lurk near anomalies, feasting on the unwary? Maybe there were 100 other copies of me right now, suffering and dying in places without clouds, and I would never know. That last line built a home in my chest and started paying rent. So I started a new practice. At trailheads and culverts and places where rock teeth bite the sky, I talk out loud. I say, we traveled down rapidly curving and branching paths, and the logic and feel of the area felt different. And I don't think it's dangerous. And I think it's strange. I let the words out like breadcrumbs. If there's another me nearby, Maybe he'll hear the pattern and stop. I write down names and addresses. People whisper to me in bad places. I keep a map of blue pins and gray pins. Blue for where I have a chance to interrupt the loop. Gray for where I don't. There are too many gray pins. But blue pins make constellations. And constellations are stories. And stories are how you keep a night from swallowing your tongue. Sometimes, driving home, I had the profoundly disturbing fear that when I glance in the rear view, there will be a pair of headlights that are mine and not mine, and the driver will be kind, decisive, and better. He will make the choice I did not. He will go back to the cave and burn it. He will drag 3 cocoons into daylight and learn to live with 4 birthdays. I try to picture that version, sleeping. He never does. Here is what I can tell you. If you feel the world tilt and the sun disappears behind heavy canopy and your stomach brands you with a compass you never asked for. 1. Trust the texture of danger, not the volume. This was strange, but not dangerous, until night invented hunger. If it feels like a library with a wrong book on the shelf, you can still breathe. If it feels like a nursery with the window open, leave. 2. At a split. The easy way is not always a virtue test. Sometimes it's just a trap door into your original footprint. The flat creek bed offered easy passage. Yes. And we emerged into our own beginning. That information is not comfort. It's a warning label. The universe may use convenience as packaging for recursion. 3. If voices you know come out of a place where your voice just went in, don't assume rescue is the verb. Assume accounting. Something out there is balancing a ledger. 4. Fibers that fall from trees do not constitute weather. When they snap back, you are looking at an industry. A machine is being fed. You can romanticize predators, or you can live to kiss your dog. Choose quick. 5. If you must enter the small cave, understand that there were hundreds, maybe even thousands, because time owns a factory. You are not the first clever person to arrive. You are not even clever. You are a resource. 6. When you meet your doubles, every sentence you say will apply to you. You can't do this. Correct. We'll sort it out later. Lie. We'll change our names. Names are receipts. You can throw them away, and the debt remains. 7. Mercy is sometimes cutting near the missing leg and memorizing a daughter's name. You will perform acts that turn you into a better story than a person. Tell yourself a person can survive that. 8. If you run, run clean. We left all of our gear, and it was the only elegant choice we made that night. I keep hearing the stranger's last instruction in non-words. He didn't say, make it mean something. He said, a name, an address. Meanings are made of thin metal. Addresses are made of doors. I drove to a door and watched a man with his life still on him gather his daughter from a bus. If he ever learns about me, I hope he thinks I'm a rumor, a geographical oddity whispered at cookouts when the fire burns square. What has changed? Very little. I still drive. Caitlin still sits in the passenger seat, and Chris still lounges in the back whenever they can stand the version of me that comes out at night. We take new hills and new trails, and sometimes we find places where nothing doubles, and the only thing falling out of trees is light. Those days feel like refund checks, but there are other days. A month ago, we found a culvert where the water ran backward for 3 heartbeats at a time, like it had learned to breathe wrong. Between the haphazard rock walls, the sun's glare seemed brightened, and the blue sky above pretended to be an ocean. We stayed until dusk, and nothing doubled, but I felt a curious and unwelcome sensation ride my spine and look around. That way, I said, and Chris sighed like a man who recognized both the script and the director. We walked until the air forgot how to be air and tried on something warmer, as if the forest were devoid of the one ingredient that keeps it honest. At a bend, we saw a gap that looked like a mouth that had misread its dentist's instructions. The land around it had the polite chaos of a hospital lobby. We stared at that shape until it stopped being a shape and started being a decision. This time, we didn't go in. I wrote down Crossroads like a last name and pulled them both back to the car. Knight rode home in the back seat and didn't talk. I am not telling you not to go. I am telling you to learn the arithmetic of your own fear. When the answer is not a number, back away. When the answer is an address, drive there and sit until a school bus explains the universe in little shoes. In the end, the only rule that has helped is this. When confronted with a path that promises to make you into two, choose the less cinematic outcome. Right is not always right. Left is not always loss. The only true direction is the one that lets you wake up tomorrow with a smaller debt. And if you can't avoid the loop, if you step out into the same dust you stepped into, then at least understand the loop is not about time or space. It is about appetite. Something out there is hungry for choices. And every time we double, the menu gets longer. I am trying to order less. I keep a notebook now with 5 columns. Sight, sensation, decision, debt, door, undersight. I write K-da, culvert, empty parking lot, quarry lip, suburban drainage, under sensation. I write strange, but not dangerous. Then cross it out. Then write strange, thus dangerous later. Under decision. I write, let's go. Write, then cross it out. Then write don't go at all. Under debt. I add names of people I couldn't help, and the names of people I will watch get off buses. Under door. I record addresses, because doors are kinder than meanings when sleep won't come. I read the notebook out loud. We traveled down rapidly curving and branching paths, I say to the dark. We passed along the top of an abrupt 40-foot cliff, I say. Silence fell, I say. We took off running into the woods. I say enough lines from that night that I begin to hope another me anywhere will hear the pattern and make the other choice. Sometimes I imagine he is the one writing these notes, and I am the echo. In that imagining, the numbers balance. We split the check. He saves 3 people. I save none. Together we save 1.5. It is not math. It is grief behaving like math. There could be 100 other copies of me out there. All of us suffering and dying in horrific ways. All of us narrating our better halves. I do not know which of us is the original. I only know I am still here. And so the debt is mine. Tomorrow we'll drive out early. We'll look for a place where the sun disappears behind heavy canopy. And we'll stand at the mouth of some geographical oddity and disappointed by choosing to go home. That, too, is a kind of bravery.